If you're awake at this hour, drifting on the edge between exhaustion and something darker, then welcome. You've found the right frequency. Here, in the small hours of the night, the world grows quieter, softer, and far more honest. Shadows take their time, memory gains weight, and the things we try not to think about finally learn how to breathe. Tonight, I'll be your companion through 5 long stories woven from the dark corners of highways, abandoned corridors, forgotten gardens, shuttered laboratories, and the places where the living and the dead brush shoulders without ever realizing it. These aren't tales meant to shock you or send you running. No, they're meant to drift beside you, like something walking just outside the beam of your headlights, like a whisper drifting along an empty skyway, like a cold breath fogging the inside of a mirror you haven't touched. So settle in. Let the night press against your windows. Let the hum of the world fall away. And whatever you do, don't open the door unless you know who's knocking. You're listening to Dread, and these are the stories the midnight keeps for itself. All the night's fault. There are nights when the world feels thinner than usual, nights when the dark outside the window doesn't just sit quietly, but seems to lean inward, testing the glass, searching for a place to breathe through. That was the kind of night Malcolm Lorne woke into, still tangled in the last threads of a dream he couldn't remember but felt in the aching stiffness of his jaw. The clock on his bedside table glowed 3:04 a.m. Steady, cold, and patient. And for a moment he thought a part of the dream had followed him into waking because his phone was vibrating with a frantic insistence that felt almost personal. The city beyond the curtains hummed in a low, distant register, the kind of hum that makes a man feel smaller than he pretends to be. Malcolm reached for the phone with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, more from irritation than fear, or at least that's what he told himself as he swiped open the message. 2 workers had fallen from the 27th floor of his newest tower. No explanation. No details, just the blunt, clipped phrasing of men too afraid or too tired to type more. Malcolm exhaled sharply, the breath scraping his throat on the way out, and shoved himself upright while the luxury sheets gathered around his waist like pale, rumpled waves. Beside him, Lily murmured something soft and broken in her sleep, the kind of sound a person only makes when the night is too heavy. For a heartbeat he envied her rest, envied the way her bare shoulder caught the faint glow of the city lights and didn't flinch from it. He told himself he admired her beauty, but the truth pressed against him like a bruise. He admired her oblivion. Some people could sleep through anything. Some people never learned what it meant to wake at 3 a.m. with something cold sitting at the base of their spine. The air outside the bedroom felt different, as if the corridor of his penthouse were holding its breath. Malcolm dressed quickly, buttoning his shirt with stiff fingers and trying not to think about why his hands refused to steady. The elevator ride down from the 33rd floor was unusually silent. Even the soft mechanical whir of the cables seemed muted, swallowed by the hour. As the doors opened into the underground garage, he hesitated not for long, but long enough to sense something like a shift in the air pressure. The slight, uneasy feeling of someone having walked across the place where you intended to step. His Audi A6 sat waiting beneath dim industrial lights that buzzed faintly, their glow trembling at the edges. He unlocked the car, slid behind the wheel, and for a moment rested his hands on the steering wheel as though grounding himself. A thin fog pressed against the far wall of the garage, an odd detail for a sealed structure. Yet Malcolm told himself it was nothing more than exhaust lingering from another vehicle. When he pulled out onto the street, the road felt too empty for a city that never slept. Even the streetlights cast their halos with an almost lethargic dimness, as if they, too, had grown exhausted of keeping the dark at bay. Halfway to the construction site, Malcolm felt the night shift again. It wasn't dramatic, just a sensation, a delicate tightening in the air, the way a room changes when someone enters it quietly. He turned into the service access road behind the tower, gravel crunching beneath the tires like brittle bones. The freight elevator at the base of the structure waited with its metal gates slightly ajar, as though someone had stepped out only moments before. Malcolm pressed the call button and listened to the machinery groan somewhere deep within the shaft. He rubbed his thumb along the ridge of his tie, trying to dislodge the knot of tension tightening beneath his sternum. When the elevator finally arrived, he stepped inside and reached for the panel but froze, because he was no longer alone. A woman stood in the far corner of the elevator, hunched beneath layers of tattered fabric that seemed more like discarded shadows than clothing. Her hair fell in stiff, matted clumps across her shoulders, and her posture was bent as though gravity had singled her out for special torment. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even appear to breathe, but she watched him. He could feel it. Malcolm's throat constricted. He swallowed hard, forcing out a brittle laugh that didn't fit the shape of the elevator. He muttered something about restricted access, about people not being allowed here. The woman didn't react. Her presence, silent and heavy, pressed against him like a smell he couldn't escape, a damp, earthy scent tinged with age and rain-soaked soil. He shifted uncomfortably, brushing at his sleeve as though her proximity had left a stain, and when the elevator jolted upward, the lights flickered with a fluttering rhythm that reminded Malcolm of a heartbeat trying to restart itself. When the elevator reached the 27th floor, the doors peeled open slowly, with the lethargy of something old and reluctant. Malcolm stepped out quickly, not looking back, but halfway across the exposed scaffolding, he felt the air change thin, cold, stretched tight as wire. He turned. The elevator was empty. Completely. Cleanly, as though no one had been there at all. His chest tightened with a cold, crawling unease. He told himself he was overtired, stressed, seeing things. But as he walked the perimeter where the two workers had fallen, another sensation crept over him. He wasn't alone on the floor. Something waited in the shadows, not moving, but aware, watching with the patience only the dead have. And when he finally returned to his car, fumbling with the keys, rain beginning to mist across the windshield, the night delivered its first undeniable message. A soft knock, barely audible, but insistent, from the passenger side window. He flinched, breath catching in his throat. Another knock, slow, deliberate, impossibly familiar in its rhythm. Malcolm's gaze slid sideways, dread rising in a cold, merciless wave. Through the rain-streaked glass, a face stared back at him. Not a face shaped by life, but one carved by memory's sunken eyes, twisted bone, a mouth that looked like it had been forced into one final question. He knew that face. He had tried for years to forget it. The dead never knock unless they want to be remembered. And tonight, the night itself had delivered her back to him. For a long moment, Malcolm sat frozen in the driver's seat, unable to draw a full breath as the rain stitched fine silver threads across the windshield. His hands hovered above the steering wheel without touching it, fingers trembling from a sickness he couldn't name. The face outside the passenger window did not move, did not blink. It simply lingered there in the dim glow of the streetlight, its expression not contorted in rage but molded by something far heavier: grief, betrayal, a sorrow that time had not softened. Through the fogged glass, the features were distorted yet unmistakable, and Malcolm felt his heart cave inward with the crushing realization that the night had not shown him a stranger. It had shown him history, a memory he had forced so deep into the dark corners of himself that he believed it had drowned there. But memories like that do not stay dead. They wait, patient and silent, until the night grows thin enough for them to surface. Malcolm reached slowly for the ignition, his knuckles whitening as the engine's low growl shuddered through the frame of the car, and the face remained. Rain streaked down the glass in trembling lines, making it appear as though she were crying on the other side. With a desperate twist of his wrist, Malcolm threw the car into gear and lurched forward into the street, tires slipping for half a heartbeat on the wet asphalt before catching. He didn't look back, but in the rearview mirror, blurred by rain, a thin silhouette remained suspended in the middle of the road, unmoving, watching him vanish into the city's deepest hours. The drive home unfolded like a fever dream, stitched together with moments of clarity, sharp enough to cut. Streetlights flickered and elongated in his peripheral vision, stretching into thin golden smears that seemed to pulse with their own breath. Every time Malcolm turned, the shadows dragged half a second behind him, lagging, as though reluctant to follow. He accelerated through an amber light that felt too still, too expectant, as if the intersection itself had been holding vigil. His thoughts tangled into a knot of denial and panic, each turn of the wheel drawing him deeper into memories he had sworn to silence. He remembered the rain from that night years ago, heavy, relentless, a curtain pulled across the world. He remembered the thud beneath the bumper, the way Lily had screamed as if the sound might rewind time, might give them a different ending. He remembered the way he refused to stop, rationalizing that no one could survive an impact like that. But the truth nagged at him even then. He didn't stop because he feared the aftermath more than the act. Detective questions, headlines, the collapse of the empire he hadn't yet built, in the face of the woman he left behind had haunted the outer edges of his dreams ever since, never fully stepping into the light but always brushing against the border of his conscience. Tonight, however, she had stepped fully into view. Her knock had been gentle, as if the dead do not need force, they need acknowledgement. He sped through the last turn toward his building, breath shallow, pulse heavy with dread. The fog that hadn't existed moments earlier now clung to the street in low, drifting layers, swirling around the tires as though guiding him or restraining him. He couldn't tell. He parked the Audi beneath the soft underground lighting, but the brightness didn't comfort him. It merely revealed how unsteady his hands had become. Malcolm forced himself to step out of the car, the air thick with a damp, earthen scent that reminded him of overturned soil and forgotten graves. He slammed the door harder than necessary, as though the sound might anchor him to the moment. But when the echo faded, he heard something else in its wake. A soft shuffling behind him, too slow for footsteps, too deliberate for wind. He didn't turn. He walked toward the private elevator, each footfall scraping against concrete with an oddly amplified resonance. When the elevator door slid open, he stepped inside quickly and pressed the button for his floor with frantic precision. The doors began their slow descent, inching shut, and in that narrowing space he caught sight of something at the edge of his vision, a sliver of movement, a shape leaning at an angle no living body could sustain, a reminder that the night had followed him home. Inside the elevator, the silence pressed hard against his skull, dense and suffocating, as though the air itself remembered what he'd done. The lights hummed softly overhead, fluctuating with a tremor that made the shadows dance along the corners like hesitant fingers. Malcolm's reflection in the mirrored wall looked wrong, washed out, eyes rimmed with something too close to fear for his liking. He forced himself to take a steadying breath, but it shuddered halfway through, breaking apart like something brittle. When the elevator finally reached his floor, the doors opened with a sluggish sigh. The penthouse corridor stretched ahead in soft, muted tones. Normally it felt luxurious, insulated, a world removed from consequence. But tonight the hallway felt cavernous and unfamiliar, as though the walls had shifted when he wasn't looking. Malcolm reached the front door, slid his key into the lock, and stood there for a long moment with one hand bracing the frame, listening for anything out of place. But the apartment breathed in quiet darkness. Perhaps Lily was asleep again. Perhaps none of this had touched her. He pushed open the door. The moment he stepped inside, he knew he was wrong. A faint metallic resonance trembled through the air like a lone, out-of-tune music box playing from a distant room. The lights were off, but the city outside cast thin stripes of gold and blue across the floorboards, fractured by the slow sway of the curtains. Malcolm paused, senses stretching into the stillness as he listened. Something in the apartment had shifted. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth again, as though the woman from the elevator had walked through these rooms, brushing her fingers across every surface. He shut the door quietly behind him, heart pounding, and made his way toward the living room, the shadows stretching across the walls like long, silent witnesses. As he rounded the corner, his breath hitched. The television, which he always turned off at night, flickered weakly with static. No picture, no sound, just a snowy landscape that seemed to pulse in a slow, unnatural rhythm. And beneath the static's muted glow, Malcolm noticed something lying on the floor, a talisman he thought he had thrown away years ago. He stared at it, dread rooting his feet to the carpet. The sight of it struck him harder than any apparition could have, because this object should not exist here anymore. He had discarded it, replaced it with something sleek, expensive, meaningless. He crouched slowly, fingers trembling as he picked it up. The charm was warm, too warm, as if it had been held moments before. A memory surfaced, an old monk pressing this very charm into Malcolm's palm the morning after the accident, murmuring words Malcolm never bothered to listen to. A warning, a plea, a chance to make things right. But he hadn't taken it. He had chosen silence. Behind him, something shifted on the hardwood floor. Malcolm rose slowly, turning his head. The apartment felt suddenly cavernous, like a cathedral carved from darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, a shape waited, unmoving, breathless, patient. The air thickened, pressing against Malcolm's ribs. The static from the television deepened into a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the floor. And though he could not see her yet, he felt her. The night had followed him home, and it had no intention of leaving without what he owed. Lily Calder had always believed there was a certain kind of quiet that belonged only to expensive homes, an engineered quiet, the sort created by triple-layered windows, seamless insulation, and floorboards polished to a shine so perfect it seemed to repel sound. But tonight, as she stepped out of the bathroom wrapped in nothing but a towel, the quiet inside the penthouse felt different. Not engineered, not luxurious. It felt watchful. The air itself seemed to thicken around her, as though the walls had drawn a slow, inward breath. She paused, eyes drifting toward the hallway as a faint tremor of unease threaded beneath her skin. There was no reason to feel this way. Malcolm had only been gone an hour. The lights were dim but not unsettling, and the city glow still seeped through the curtains in its usual soft blue haze. Yet something in the atmosphere had shifted. It was subtle at first, a kind of heaviness behind the silence, like a heartbeat pressing too close to her ear. Lily tightened her towel around her shoulders and shook off the sensation, telling herself she was simply tired, that the late-night bath and the wine she'd sipped earlier had melted her nerves into something fragile. But then she heard it, a small, delicate tapping behind her. She turned sharply toward the bathroom door, her pulse flaring. The tiles glistened softly from the steam, the faint scent of lavender soap still floating in the air. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet something about the room felt different from the one she'd just stepped out of, as if the steam on the mirror had arranged itself into a pattern she wasn't meant to understand. Lily stepped back into the bathroom cautiously, each footfall whispering against the warm tile. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The mirror was still fogged, but not completely. Down the center, as though traced by a fingertip, a thin trail had cleared, forming a line straight through the middle of her reflection. She exhaled, trying to laugh at her own unease, but the breath caught in her chest. The partial reflection staring back at her looked wrong, not because the features were distorted, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection wasn't reacting to her movement. Not exactly, but to something behind her. Slowly, hesitantly, Lily wiped her palm across the mirror. The steam parted reluctantly, revealing the full reflection of the bathroom, and for a split second, she saw a second figure standing behind her, hunched and indistinct, like a shadow given weight. She spun around, heart pounding so forcefully it bruised the inside of her ribs. The room was empty, utterly, impossibly empty. Yet the tile floor felt colder now, as though something had passed over it only moments before. She backed out of the bathroom, pulling the door shut behind her with a hand that trembled more than she wanted to admit. The apartment greeted her with another shift in atmosphere, a faint metallic hum, a vibration that seemed to crawl along the baseboards. Lily froze, listening. The sound wasn't coming from the kitchen appliances or the ventilation system. It was deeper, older, as if the building itself were remembering something unpleasant. She tightened her towel again and stepped into the bedroom, searching for her phone. But the moment her fingers brushed the nightstand, the television in the living room clicked on by itself. The sound made her jump, the towel slipping slightly from her grasp. She stood motionless for a breath, then walked cautiously toward the living room, each step echoing slightly more loudly than the one before. The TV screen glowed in eerie, bluish white, casting pale light across the furniture and walls. Lily reached for the remote with a steadying breath, only to freeze again, because the screen wasn't showing static anymore. It was showing rain, heavy rain, blurring the view from a dashboard camera mounted inside an old car. Lily felt her mouth go dry. The scene was familiar. Not just familiar intimately, painfully known. She whispered Malcolm's name, as though speaking it might anchor her to something solid. But the only response was the next frame of the footage. The video jolted as the car hit a bump. A street lamp ahead flickered. Lily felt her knees weaken. She knew what came next. She had lived this night. survived it, in a way, but she had never seen the footage from this angle. They had smashed the dashboard camera after the accident. Malcolm had thrown it into a drainage ditch before they fled. So, where had this come from? Her breath shortened as the video played on, the tires swerving, the rain hammering the windshield. Then, a dark figure in the road, the scream of brakes, a sickening thud that seemed to vibrate through the living room floor. Lily covered her mouth with her hand, a sharp cry trapped behind her fingers. The camera jolted again as the car rolled forward, hesitated, then sped away. A woman's limp form receded into darkness behind the bumper. Lily couldn't breathe. She remembered that night in perfect detail. Malcolm shaking hands on the wheel, her own sobs, the way she'd begged him to stop, to check, to do anything but drive away. He hadn't listened. He'd convinced her they were doing what they had to do, that reporting the accident would destroy them both. And she had listened. That was the worst part. She had listened. The screen flickered again, and now the camera was closer to the body. Much closer. As if someone were kneeling beside it. The woman's face was turned toward the lens, her features pale beneath the rain, eyes open but unfocused. Lily felt her heart pound against her ribs, straining to break free. Then the image shifted. The woman's eyes moved, not subtly, not ambiguously. They rolled upward until they stared directly into the camera, directly at Lily. The air in the room collapsed inward like a lung folding shut. Lily staggered backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. Her breath hitched in broken bursts. She tore her gaze away from the screen and scanned the room, half expecting the woman to be standing somewhere in the shadows, watching her with the same hollow intensity. As she backed away, something brushed lightly against her ankle, soft but deliberate, like the trailing edge of a garment. She stumbled into the wall, clutching at the towel as panic clawed up her throat. The lights flickered again. The metallic hum deepened, and from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic tapping began, the same pattern Malcolm had heard against his car window. Lily pressed herself against the wall, the cool surface anchoring her for a fleeting moment. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it seemed to resonate through the floor itself. And then, from the partially open closet door, she heard a voice, a fragile, wavering whisper that drifted across the room with the softness of breath against glass. "Why did you leave me there?" The towel slipped from Lily's hands, pooling silently at her feet. Malcolm had not intended to run. He had never been a man who fled from anything, not competition, not failure, not consequence. Yet as he stood in the silent glow of his living room, clutching the warm talisman he thought he had thrown away long ago, something primal and ancient surged inside him, an instinct so buried beneath pride that he barely recognized it. Fear, not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the slow, crushing fear that comes from knowing the past has grown teeth and begun to close its jaw. He could feel the walls listening. He could feel the night pressing its weight against the windows. Somewhere deeper in the apartment, the floorboards creaked in a slow, dragging rhythm that did not belong to Lily and did not belong to him. Malcolm moved toward the sound with steps that felt like pushing through water, each breath thick and reluctant. The static from the television deepened into a low, vibrating hum, as though the voice behind it were trying to crawl into the room itself. And then, from the hallway leading to the master bedroom, he heard Lily scream, a single, trembling sound that carried both horror and recognition. Malcolm dropped the charm. He found Lily in the bedroom doorway, her body rigid, her eyes wide with an unspoken truth she had kept hidden even from herself. The towel lay crumpled around her feet, forgotten. As she stood transfixed by something only she could see, Malcolm followed her gaze to the mirror across the room. The surface was smeared with condensation, though the room was cold, and through the dim haze he saw a figure slowly taking shape, not in full detail, but in suggestion the shadow of a woman leaning too close to the glass, as though studying Lily's reflection with a tenderness twisted into accusation. The shape shifted with the grace of something not bound by bone, and when it pressed its forehead to the mirror, the glass fogged outward in a slow, trembling bloom. Malcolm reached for Lily, but she recoiled instinctively, as if his touch carried the weight of the memory the night had brought back to her. The woman in the glass tilted her head, her outline rippling like a candle flame caught in breath. Lily whispered something Malcolm couldn't hear, a confession carried on a trembling exhale, and the figure mirrored the movement perfectly, as though sharing lungs with her. The mirror fractured not in shards, but in reflection. Instead of showing the bedroom, it now showed rain, a drenched roadside, a car door slamming. Malcolm felt the blood drain from his face as the mirror replayed the night of the accident with merciless clarity. Not the version he remembered, not the version he tried to justify, the version the dead remembered. The woman's body lay twisted on the wet asphalt, rainwater pooling beneath her hair like ink. Malcolm watched his younger self approach her, watched panic war with selfishness in his expression, watched him take a single step backward before fleeing into the night. Lily watched herself. Too watched the moment she opened the passenger door, drenched in rain, eyes full of dread and obedience. She had begged him to stop. She had cried, but in the end, she had gotten back into the car, and the night had not forgotten. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the air filling with the unmistakable scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The closet door trembled, creaking open by slow degrees, the darkness inside expanding like a held breath released. A soft, rhythmic dragging sound emerged as though fingertips were grazing the wood. Lily clutched her chest, her breath ragged. Malcolm stepped in front of her, not out of bravery, but out of the crushing realization that everything unraveling around them was his doing. The night was not hunting Lily. It was hunting him, and Lily was simply standing too close to the target. He reached toward the closet, unsure whether he intended to confront or beg, but before his hand touched the door, the dim light flickered and the golden statue of prosperity, new, polished, expensive, toppled from the dresser and shattered against the floor. The sound echoed across the room like a verdict. A wind that did not belong to the world outside swept through the bedroom, extinguishing the last traces of warmth. Malcolm felt the air twist around him, tugging at his clothes, pulling at his breath. Then, for the first time since the haunting began, he heard her. Not a scream, not a growl, a whisper, soft, low, and unbearably human. You replaced everything that mattered. The words did not come from the closet. They came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the mirror, the space between his ribs. Malcolm staggered backward, struck by the weight of her voice, by the grief braided into it. Lily collapsed to her knees, covering her ears as though the whisper had cut through something fragile inside her. Malcolm tried to speak, to argue, to explain, but no words formed, because the truth, the one he had buried alongside that woman's unmarked grave, rose up in him like floodwater. He had taken the monk's charm once. He had accepted it with the trembling humility of a man who truly feared what he had done, but he had discarded it when the fear faded. He had chosen wealth over repentance. He had chosen comfort over accountability. He had chosen silence over truth, and the night had come to collect what silence owed. The closet door slammed shut with a violent force, the impact tremoring through the floorboards. The mirror cracked from corner to corner, not breaking but veining like frost. Lily screamed again, not in terror but in the raw shock of being shown the truth she had spent years suppressing. Malcolm grabbed her, pulled her against him, but the shadows around them shifted, tightening, circling. The room felt alive with intent, with purpose, with the memory of the woman whose life they had stolen. And then the lights went out, plunging the penthouse into a darkness so complete it felt like the night itself had swallowed them whole. Out of that darkness came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, dragging, approaching. The rhythm was wrong, not matching any living gait. It was deliberate, patient, the cadence of someone who no longer needed to hurry. Malcolm held Lily close, heart pounding so violently he felt nauseous. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. A long silence followed. Then came the whisper, closer this time, as though lips hovered inches from his ear. "Remember?" The door creaked open, and Malcolm realized, with suffocating clarity, that the night had not come to frighten them. It had come to finish what they tried to escape. For a heartbeat, Malcolm truly believed the darkness would swallow them whole. It felt alive, dense, pulsing, almost tender in the way it pressed against his skin, as if welcoming him into a place he had unknowingly belonged for years. Lily clung to him, her breath shaking against his chest, her body trembling not just from fear but from the crushing recognition that they were no longer spectators in this haunting. They were participants. The bedroom door eased open with a low, agonizing moan, and in the faint sliver of light that spilled from the hallway, Malcolm saw a shape lean into view. It wasn't clear. The edges bled into the shadows, as though whatever stood there existed half in this world and half in the place the night keeps for the unresolved. A damp, earthen smell drifted into the room, the scent of overturned soil, of rain-soaked pavement, of a life ended abruptly under storm clouds. Malcolm's throat tightened with memory. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't need to. It had already entered the room the moment the lights died, already taken its place in the air, already filled the silence with all the words he had refused to speak. The floor beneath them seemed to soften, almost liquefy, as though the apartment itself resented the weight of the truth crouched inside it. Malcolm pulled Lily to her feet, urging her toward the hallway, each step a fight against an unseen force tightening around their ankles. The corridor stretched ahead like a tunnel carved through fog, elongated and shifting at the edges as though the architecture of the penthouse had surrendered its shape to the night's will. Lily stumbled, catching herself on the wall. Her fingers brushed a framed painting, a cheap visage of prosperity Malcolm had bought to replace the protective charm he once owned, and the frame fell instantly, the glass shattering upon impact, not scattered, not chaotic shattering into a near-perfect circle, as though something had pressed outward from the center. The image beneath the broken glass was warped, riddled with cracks that formed the unmistakable outline of a face. Lily recoiled with a strangled cry, and Malcolm tightened his grip on her arm, forcing himself to keep moving even as dread crawled up the back of his throat with the slow persistence of vines. When they reached the living room, the glow from the television flickered again. Rain, headlights, a wet road, a memory repeating itself in perfect, merciless clarity. Malcolm wanted to look away, but something deeper than fear compelled him to face the screen. The footage shifted, zooming not on the accident but on his own face from that night. The panic, the calculation, the cold resolve. He watched himself choose silence. He watched Lily choose him over the truth. And then the image changed. The woman they hid her form rose from the pavement, not in a grotesque or unnatural way, but with a slow, weary motion, like someone waking from a long sleep. She walked toward the camera, not limping, not staggering, walking with the calm certainty of a soul who had waited long enough. Malcolm felt the density of the moment settle into his chest. The figure on the screen raised her hand and knocked 3 soft taps, the same tapping he heard on the car window hours earlier, the same tapping now echoing across the living room as if the screen itself had reached into the physical world. The knocking behind him grew louder. Malcolm spun, pulling Lily behind him instinctively. The balcony door rattled as though struck by a storm gust, but there was no storm, only fog, thick and luminous, seeping into the edges of the glass. Malcolm stepped backward, his heel brushing the talisman that had fallen earlier. The charm trembled faintly, as if breathing. For a moment, a brief, impossible moment, the air around them seemed to ease. The fog thinned, the knocking stalled. Lily exhaled a trembling sigh, clutching his arm. Malcolm bent down, picked up the charm, and for the first time in years held it with reverence rather than mockery. He felt its warmth pulse against his palm. The night reacted instantly. The fog surged forward like a living tide, engulfing the balcony door, the windows, the ceiling. The air darkened, not with shadow, but with presence. The floorboards groaned beneath a pressure that felt like footsteps made not of flesh, but of memory. The talisman in Malcolm's hand grew hotter, vibrating with a desperate urgency. And then he heard it, the same words the monk spoke to him years ago, not in the monk's voice, but in his own, formed from a part of him that had always known the truth. Not forgiveness, not escape, recognition. The floor gave way. Not physically, structurally, the penthouse remained intact, but to Malcolm it felt as though the world tilted beneath him, dropping him into a place outside time. He and Lily stumbled into a darkness that pulsed like a heartbeat. Fog wrapped around them, cold and damp, shaping itself into the outline of the same roadside where everything began. Rain fell not from the ceiling, but from the air itself, each droplet carrying the echo of the night they ruined. Lily screamed as her bare feet splashed into shallow, icy water. Malcolm looked up. She stood before them, not as a corpse, not as a twisted phantom, but as the woman she had been before they ended her life, a simple figure in rain-soaked clothes, hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes full of a sorrow so vast it felt like a world unto itself. She did not move. She did not accuse. She simply waited for Malcolm to speak. He dropped to his knees. Words spilled from him, not polished, not poetic, but raw and broken. He admitted everything. The fear, the selfishness, the years of silence. He apologized, not for survival, but for choosing cowardice over compassion. Lily fell beside him, sobbing into her hands. The woman listened. The night listened. The fog thickened, winding around Malcolm's shoulders like a shroud. And then, as though some old law had been fulfilled, the woman's outline wavered. The rain eased. The fog brightened. Malcolm felt the charm in his hand grow cool, its purpose completed. The woman stepped back into the fog, her form dissolving into the night that had carried her here. Not vanishing, not erased, returning to a place beyond vengeance, beyond suffering, beyond the weight of the moment they stole from her. Malcolm reached out, but his fingers closed around empty air. The apartment snapped back into existence around them. Malcolm collapsed onto the floor, gasping, drenched in sweat. Lily lay beside him, trembling. The television was blank, the fog gone. The night outside, still and ordinary, but the air felt lighter, almost hollow, as though the spirit had taken something with her, something heavy, something deserved. In the days that followed, Malcolm rebuilt her grave with his own hands. He donated quietly to the families of the workers. He stepped away from his projects, his empire, his life of carefully curated power. He and Lily slept with the lights on for weeks, afraid not of the ghost, but of their own memories. But sometimes, at 3-4 a.m., Malcolm would wake abruptly, not from fear, not from guilt, but from the faint sensation of 3 soft taps against the window. Not angry, not demanding, just reminding him that the night always remembers its debts and always comes to collect what was once owed. Night terror at the worksite. Ethan stood alone beneath the flickering security lamp outside the restroom block, the pale beam stretching across wet concrete like a trembling ribbon, and for a moment he simply listened to the static hush of the wind brushing against half-finished scaffolds, trying to decide whether the scream he'd heard minutes earlier had truly come from within the men's washroom, or whether the long hours, the outbreak, panic, and the oppressive silence of a quarantined construction site had begun to warp the way he perceived sound. But the trembling, naked workers who had stumbled past him, faces drained of color, bodies shivering not from cold but from a terror they could neither articulate nor rationalize, had been unmistakably real, and the way the leader of that frantic trio had collapsed in the mud while pointing a shaking hand toward the women's restroom had carved a cold pit somewhere beneath Ethan's ribs. So he pushed the door open with the kind of resigned determination reserved for men who have long grown accustomed to walking into situations they wish someone else could handle. The heavy metal door moaned in protest, the air inside exhaling a damp, sour breath that carried the scent of mildew, cleaning chemicals, and something faintly metallic like old coins soaked in stagnant water. The overhead lights buzzed weakly, casting erratic shadows across the cracked tile floor. And when Ethan stepped inside, the hairs along his forearms lifted, as though a static charge had passed through the entire room. He scanned the row of sinks, the dripping faucets, catching the light in tiny, trembling droplets, and for a brief second he thought the room was empty. But then one of the fluorescent bulbs above him made a soft popping sound, almost like a knuckle cracking, and the bulb darkened, leaving a faint ribbon of smoke curling upward. Ethan frowned, took another step forward, and the next bulb closer to the stall area burst inward with a sharp snap, glass sprinkling the floor in a glittering arc. He froze, watching as the shard settled, the silence gathering around him with a heaviness that made the air feel viscous, almost liquid. His mind raced, reaching for explanations rooted in the natural world. Faulty wiring from construction delays, humidity causing a short, the cold night air mixing with warm bulbs. But the way the bulbs were failing one after the other, each a step deeper into the restroom, felt deliberate, like a series of breadcrumbs left by something that wanted him to follow. Ethan took a slow breath, willing his pulse to steady, and advanced toward the dim corridor between the stalls. The tiles here seemed darker, as though stained by moisture that had seeped upward from the floor rather than downward from the pipes, and the shadows between the stalls stretched unnaturally long, clinging to their corners as though reluctant to release whatever they held. Another bulb burst above him, closer now, the sound sharper, like enamel cracking between metal teeth, and a gust of cold air rushed down the row of stalls with a force that defied the airtight structure of the building. Ethan braced himself, instinctively raising an arm to shield his face, but the wind carried no debris. Instead, it brought an overwhelming sensation of grief, a heaviness, so sudden and so complete that he felt as though the air had been stolen from his lungs. He steadied himself against a wall, the tile shockingly cold beneath his palm, and let his gaze drift toward the women's restroom entrance, a narrow, sealed doorway, currently taped off due to the quarantine protocols. The tape fluttered, though no wind touched it, and as Ethan watched, transfixed, the air grew colder still, condensing into a fine mist that curled in slow, deliberate spirals across the floor. Then he heard it, a sound so soft and fragile that it might have been mistaken for a pipe settling or a distant drip of water, but it carried a cadence unmistakably human, a low, broken sob, a woman's sob, the kind that comes from someone not merely crying, but grieving with the entire weight of their being. The sound seeped through the sealed door, threading itself into the cold air, growing clearer with each heartbeat until Ethan could make out the rhythm of breath between the sobs, the trembling catch at the end of each exhale, the depth of a sorrow that had lingered too long in a place that had offered no mercy, no witness, no final prayer. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face as a pressure built behind his ears, a sense of altitude sickness, though he hadn't climbed a single step, and he took another cautious stride forward, unable to convince himself that turning back would be safer than moving deeper into the unknown. As he approached the women's restroom door, the sobbing sharpened into clarity, no longer muffled, no longer distant. It was as though the voice belonged to someone crouched just inches away, pressed against the door, whispering her grief directly into the cold metal. Ethan reached out, fingertips trembling, barely brushing the surface when an unseen force slammed into him with the blunt, brutal strength of a moving vehicle. His body lifted off the ground for a fraction of a second before crashing backward onto the tile. The breath punched from his lungs, a shockwave ringing through his bones. For a moment he lay there, stunned, the world around him shaking in and out of focus as the last intact bulb above his head began to flicker wildly. The sobbing had stopped, replaced now by a silence so absolute that he could hear the faint buzz of electricity traveling through the walls, the distant hum of wind slipping between the scaffolding outside, and the frantic pounding of his own pulse in his ears. He pushed himself up on trembling elbows, gasping as he tried to reorient himself, and when he finally lifted his gaze toward the women's restroom door, he saw that the caution tape was no longer fluttering. It was hanging perfectly still, as though the air around it had frozen in place. He became aware then of another sound, so faint he might have dismissed it if not for how eerily out of place it seemed, a slow, deliberate creaking from one of the far stalls, the kind of creak a door makes when gently pushed by a hand that does not wish to be heard. Ethan's pulse surged anew as he turned his head toward the men's stalls, where shadows pooled heavily beneath each door. Another soft creak followed, then another, forming a subtle rhythm like soft breaths. Ethan forced himself to stand, legs unsteady, and for a moment he simply listened, trying to separate imagination from reality. But when the final bulb overhead burst in a violent explosion of glass, plunging the restroom into near total darkness save for the weak glow of the emergency exit sign, Ethan felt something brush lightly against the back of his neck, cold, damp, and unmistakably intentional. He spun around, heart slamming against his ribs, but the room behind him was empty, nothing but fractured shadows and drifting mist. Yet he could not shake the certainty that something was standing just beyond sight, watching him with eyes that had once belonged to someone alive, someone wronged, someone who had not been given the dignity of being remembered. The weight of that gaze pressed against him, and in that moment, Ethan understood that what was happening here had nothing to do with electrical faults or the fraying nerves of quarantined workers. Something old, something tied to the land beneath the concrete had been awakened by disrespect, and it had chosen the restroom block as the place to make itself known. The emergency lights flickered back to life, just as Ethan stumbled out of the restroom block, his breath shuddering in broken waves as he braced an arm against the outer wall, trying to steady the vertigo that clung stubbornly to his skull like static. The construction site around him, normally a forest of scaffolding and skeletal beams stretching quietly into the night, now looked distorted by shadows that seemed to shift with their own intention, as though the darkness itself had begun rearranging the shape of familiar structures. He inhaled sharply, the cold air burning his lungs with the metallic taste of fear, and for a few strained seconds he debated whether to call in backup, except every worker on site was already stretched thin, quarantined, exhausted, and terrified of the outbreak. Dragging anyone else into this would add chaos to confusion. But before he could collect his thoughts, a sound cut across the night, footsteps pounding against the gravel path. Urgent, uneven, frantic. Ethan lifted his head, pulse flaring as a cluster of workers sprinted toward him from the direction of the dormitory block, their faces pale with terror, their voices overlapping into a chaotic flood of pleas, warnings, and incoherent strings of fear. He raised both hands to calm them, but one man seized his sleeve with trembling fingers, gasping that someone inside had lost his mind, that he was climbing walls, that he had broken the women's restroom again, and that he was speaking with a voice that wasn't his. Another worker, eyes widened the way only true dread can widen them, insisted that the man Wayne Hollow, a respected and ordinarily stoic welder, had been muttering things no sane person would know, words that sounded like confessions whispered by someone standing behind him. Though no one was there, Ethan didn't wait for the details to settle. He sprinted toward the dormitory block, the gravel under his boots scattering like dry bones across concrete, and the closer he got, the stronger the sensation grew that the air itself had thickened into a damp, suffocating pressure that squeezed at his temples. The hallway lights inside the dormitory flickered violently, illuminating the narrow corridor in frantic pulses that made every movement look disjointed and unnatural, as though reality were stuttering between frames. The workers parted nervously as Ethan approached Wayne's room. Some pressed themselves flat against the walls. Others clutched at their arms as though cold had seeped into them from the inside. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped inside cautiously, the stale air greeting him with a stagnant heaviness, as though the room had not breathed in hours. Wayne sat at the edge of his bed, back hunched, head bowed, his thick hands resting limp against his knees as though drained of life. For a moment, Ethan thought the man had collapsed from exhaustion, but then Wayne's shoulders twitched in a slow, unnatural rhythm, and a sound, soft, wavering, unmistakably feminine, slipped through the room, forming itself into words Ethan could not fully understand. Wayne lifted his head. His eyes were unfocused, not wild but distant, as if fixed on something beyond the walls of the room, something only he could see. His lips parted, and the woman's voice emerged again, trembling in a way that scraped painfully against the edges of Ethan's nerves. It was not an imitation. It was a possession of sound itself, a memory being replayed through a vessel who did not understand the meaning of the words he was speaking. Ethan felt the room tighten around him as Wayne's voice shifted into a trembling litany, recounting not images, but sensations, the cold of the restroom tiles, the humiliation of being watched, the despair of being ignored, the grief of dying unseen. The words tumbled out of him like a confession dragged from the depths of the drowned, and Ethan realized with a nauseating clarity that Wayne was not merely repeating a ghost story or hallucinating from exhaustion. Something had attached itself to him, something wronged, something longing to speak. When Wayne suddenly rose to his feet, the movement was too fluid for a man his size, too graceful for a body built from years of hard labor, and Ethan instinctively reached for the taser at his belt. Wayne stepped forward with slow, deliberate precision, his hands trembling at his sides as though resisting another force guiding them. His mouth twisted, his eyes rolled upward, and the woman's voice surged out of him again, this time louder, shaped by anguish rather than sorrow, carrying the weight of someone pleading not to be forgotten. The workers behind Ethan gasped, some retreating down the hallway, others clutching each other in a trembling huddle as Wayne's words crescendoed into a fractured, sobbing wail. Then, in a motion so abrupt it snapped through the air like a whip, Wayne lunged at the wall, slamming his fists against it as though trying to claw his way through. Ethan leapt forward, firing the taser, and Wayne collapsed in a spasming heap on the cold floor, the female voice breaking apart into static as consciousness drained from him. For several long seconds, Ethan could only stand there, chest heaving, unsure whether the trembling in his hands was from adrenaline, fear, or the crushing realization that whatever was haunting the site had now seeped into the minds and bodies of the living. When the medical team arrived moments later, they found Wayne pale, unresponsive, his pulse erratic but steady, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids as though dreaming a nightmare he could not escape. They asked if he was infected, if this was fever-induced delirium, but Ethan could not bring himself to lie. He muttered something about shock, exhaustion, the stress of quarantine. They accepted it reluctantly, but their eyes betrayed their unease. When Wayne finally stirred, hours later, he blinked up at Ethan with the disorientation of someone waking in a foreign land, and when Ethan asked him gently what he remembered, Wayne shook his head slowly and said he could not recall leaving his bed, could not recall climbing through ventilation ducts, and certainly could not recall speaking with a woman's voice. All he remembered was a moment of cold, a pressure against his eyelids, and the overwhelming sensation that someone had placed a hand over his face and whispered, "Don't look at me." The confession struck Ethan with such force that he had to step outside to breathe. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and damp clothing, but beneath that lingered another scent, faint, earthy, familiar in the way of grief. As he leaned against the wall, steadying himself, the workers watched him with wide, fearful eyes, waiting for him to explain, to reassure, to undo the dread that clung to all of them. But Ethan had no answers, only the creeping certainty that the land itself was remembering an old wound, and that the restroom built hastily, carelessly, disrespectfully had cracked open a boundary never meant to be crossed. The night outside pressed silently against the dormitory windows, and just before Ethan turned away, he thought he heard it again, a soft, broken sob coming from somewhere beneath the floor, rising through the concrete like water seeping into a forgotten grave. The dawn had not yet broken when Ethan returned to the edge of the worksite. The night still crouched low over the unfinished buildings like a vast animal unwilling to retreat, and as he walked past the barricades toward the now silent restroom block, he felt an exhaustion that reached beyond his bones, settling into the deeper parts of him where fear becomes memory and memory becomes an ache that never really leaves. The incident with Wayne had left the entire construction crew shaken into a fragile, buzzing quiet. Men who once shouted across scaffolds now spoke only in low murmurs, glancing frequently toward the women's restroom as though expecting the door to open of its own accord. Word had reached the site management, then the district health office, and finally a local elder from a neighborhood bordering the construction zone, a thin man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen more funerals than celebrations, who had arrived at daybreak, accompanied by a junior city official, desperate to avoid further panic under the shadow of the SARS quarantine. Ethan stood beside them as the elder walked the perimeter of the restroom, his steps slow, deliberate, reverent, in a way that made the air feel different, almost thinner. The elder ran his fingers along the concrete walls, pausing as though listening to what lay beneath the surface, and when he knelt beside the cracked foundation stone near the women's entrance, the wind shifted suddenly, sweeping dust and cold air across the narrow yard. Without looking up, the elder murmured that this place had once been a memorial, a small stone marker erected decades ago for a woman who had died under tragic and deeply private circumstances. The circumstances the community had chosen not to speak of openly, but had quietly honored through offerings, incense, and an unspoken rule never to defile the spot. He said the memorial had been removed hastily during the first phase of construction, dismissed as irrelevant, and when the restroom foundation was poured directly over the site, the land had become restless, not angry, he clarified, but restless, like a wound that had been reopened and left exposed beneath trampling feet and careless renovation. Some places, he said, do not forget what they hold. Ethan listened in a silence that tightened around his ribs, remembering the sobs from the sealed door, the force that had thrown him across the tiles, the voice that poured from Wayne's throat like a trapped confession breaking through. He recalled the cold hand Wayne described, the words, "Don't look at me," whispered with the tremor of someone who had been watched in a moment meant to remain private, unseen, undisturbed. The restroom's presence in the middle of that memory-laden ground had been a violation of privacy, of sanctity, of a boundary that had already been crossed once by someone who never meant harm but caused it all the same. Ethan found himself staring at the women's entrance, the tape still hanging motionless despite the breeze that stirred his own hair, and he wondered what it must feel like for a soul bound to a place not out of vengeance but out of unfinished grief, its final hiding place replaced by fluorescent lights and tiled floors that now echoed with strangers' footsteps. The elders straightened with a sigh that seemed to come from centuries of watching people forget the land beneath them, and he declared the solution simple yet necessary. The restroom must be demolished, relocated, and the memorial restored with respect, not as a religious act, but as an acknowledgement, a correction of a wrong that had allowed sorrow to seep upward like cold water rising through cracked stone. Within hours, even under quarantine restrictions, the demolition crew assembled with quiet urgency. The men moved with a solemnity Ethan had never seen in them before, their usual grumbles replaced with an almost ritualistic obedience, as though they too felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the corners of the fog-draped site. The first blow of the sledgehammer against the women's restroom wall echoed through the yard with a deep, resonant crack, and Ethan felt the vibration travel through the soles of his boots, up his legs, into his chest. The wall crumbled more easily than expected, as if its foundation had weakened not by time but by something that had hollowed it from within. As the debris fell, a gust of cold air swept outward from the exposed interior, brushing past the workers with a softness that did not belong to the sledgehammers or the collapsing concrete. One man paused mid-swing, wiping at his eyes, though he insisted no dust had gotten into them, and Ethan noticed for a brief, fleeting moment that the sobbing he had heard the night before seemed to recede, fading into the cold morning air as though drifting back to a place it had long been waiting to return to. When the final piece of the structure collapsed, the elder stepped forward and placed a small stone, simple, unmarked, humble at the approximate center of the disturbed earth. He lit a thin stick of incense despite the restrictions, murmuring words that were neither prayer nor spell, but something quieter, an apology, a recognition, a promise. Ethan watched the smoke rise and curl, dissipating into the pale morning like a departing breath. He felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't noticed forming until now, and for the first time since the haunting began, the air around the site no longer felt charged with grief. It felt empty, not hollow, but peaceful, the way a field feels after a heavy snow covers the last of autumn's wounds. Weeks later, after the quarantine was lifted and the workers dispersed to other projects, Ethan returned to the site one last time to collect equipment and sign off on the final report. The memorial stone still stood, accompanied now by a small wooden plaque explaining the land's history and asking future visitors to treat the area with respect. The new restroom block had been constructed far from the old foundation, away from the place where the ground had learned to remember. As Ethan walked across the quiet site, the sun sinking low in a bruise-colored sky, he paused beside the demolished area, where frost-coated soil lay undisturbed. The wind tugged gently at his jacket, carrying the faintest trace of moisture, and in that breathless pause between day and night, he heard a soft sound, not a sob, not a wail, but a quiet, trembling sigh, a release, a farewell. Ethan stood still for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around him like snowfall, and when he finally turned to leave, he found himself glancing back one last time, not out of fear, but out of respect. The ground no longer felt restless. It felt relieved. But as he walked toward the exit gate, boots crunching over gravel, damp with the evening chill, he could not shake the thought that some places keep their stories buried only until they are disturbed, and some spirits remain bound not out of vengeance, but out of the simple, aching, need to be seen. And sometimes, when the world becomes too busy or too frightened to listen, the night itself must speak in their place, reminding those who pass through that what is built upon forgotten grief will one day be asked to remember it again. The night banquet. I always thought the night would forget me eventually. The time would smother the memory of my mistakes, the way dust slowly buries an abandoned object until even those who once knew it no longer recognize what it used to be. But guilt is strange. It doesn't fade like bruises or scars. It lingers like the faintest vibration in a quiet room, something you don't hear until the rest of the world goes silent. And on the night everything began again, my first night of real freedom after 3 long years inside a cell, that vibration finally grew loud enough for me to feel it pressing against my ribs. I'd been out of prison for barely 2 months, long enough for people to stop staring, yet not long enough for me to stop noticing when they did. I had rebuilt my body, hardened my face, and taken control of a small but profitable debt collection outfit that my old acquaintances had set aside for me. Most men who leave prison want a clean slate. I wanted a ledger, something that told me exactly who owed what and why. Some debts can be paid in cash, others require presence, confrontation, closure, and some cannot be paid at all. I didn't know which kind I was holding when I first saw Daniel Frost's name printed across a thin beige folder, but something inside me tightened the way a fist does when instinct pulls it toward a blow. I told myself I didn't care anymore. I told myself that betrayal was a past life, that the affair between my best friend and my wife was an old wound, stitched closed by prison bars and time. But when I opened the folder and saw Daniel's signature at the bottom of a contract he had defaulted on, I felt an old heat crawl up my spine, something like rage, but colder, more deliberate, with edges sharp enough to carve through the numbness I had worn like armor for years. What unsettled me wasn't his debt. It was the memory of that night 3 years ago, the night I nearly killed him. People imagine attempted murder as an explosion of violence, a tornado of limbs and blind fury. But the truth is quieter, stranger, almost organized in its own sick geometry. I remember the taste of iron at the back of my throat, the trembling heat of betrayal surging through my arms, the way the room seemed to thicken with an invisible fog. I remember stepping toward him with hands that did not feel like mine. And I remember something else, something I've never been able to explain. A force, subtle, cold, impossible, pushing me off balance just as I swung. Not enough to save him fully, not enough to stop me entirely, but enough to redirect the blow, enough to keep the blood from being final. I tried again hours later, in the middle of the kitchen where we had once shared meals and promises that now tasted like lies. The knife felt perfect at first, solid, heavy, meant for slicing through bones of truth. But as I raised it, the weight doubled, then tripled, as though unseen hands had reached down upon my wrist, pressing it toward the floor. I blamed adrenaline at the time, blamed hesitance, blamed myself for not having the courage to finish what betrayal had started. But sometimes I wake in the early hours of morning, the hour when the air feels thinner and memory grows teeth, and I know with a certainty that frightens me more than prison ever did, that I was not alone in that room. Something was there, something that intervened, something that decided Daniel would live and I would fall. That thought returned to me as I held the folder under the dim lamp on my office desk, the overhead bulb humming with the tired vibration of a building older than anything still functioning should be. I felt the temptation rise like smoke from a dying ember. Not the urge to kill him again. God knows I don't want that, but the urge to look him in the eye, to confront the man who broke my life in half, to see whether he still flinched at the memory of my hands around his throat. And when my associates told me his office would be empty that night, that security cycles would be minimal due to a system update, I told myself I only needed his financial records, that it was professional, necessary, mundane. But a man doesn't lie to others when he already knows how to lie to himself. I wanted to see the space where he worked, the objects he touched, the little pieces of a life he built after destroying mine. So, just past midnight, I walked into his building with a lockpick kit, a pair of gloves, and a heat in my chest I pretended was just adrenaline. The office was colder than I expected, colder than any building should be after hours, as though the air conditioning had been left running long after everyone had gone home. My breath formed faint clouds in the darkness as I made my way through the cubicle maze, the fluorescent fixtures above flickering with a low-bellied hum that unsettled me more than it should have. I found Daniel's office easily. The nameplate on the door was polished clean, too clean, as if someone had recently wiped it down with meticulous care. Inside, the air was even colder, the shadows clinging to the corners like strands of unwashed cloth. I worked quickly, plugged a drive into his workstation, copied the files, checked the drawers for anything relevant, and that was when I found it. A small carved wooden figurine sitting inside the lowest drawer, wrapped in a cloth I recognized instantly. It was the last gift I had ever given him, back when loyalty between us still meant something. A tiny folklore guardian meant to symbolize restraint and watchfulness. We'd laughed about it years ago, joked that it would keep us from doing anything stupid. Seeing it again stopped my breath for a moment. I lifted it from the drawer, feeling the weight settle into my palm, strangely warm, heavier than a piece of wood should ever be. And for the first time in years, the memory of that invisible force, the shove, the weight on my wrist surged forward so vividly I nearly dropped the figurine onto the carpet. That was when the lights went out. All of them. Not one by one. Not in a gradual dimming the way old bulbs sometimes fail, but instantly, with a totality that swallowed the room whole. My pulse hammered hard enough to hurt, my ears filling with the rush of my own blood. For a moment, I couldn't tell whether the darkness was real or something rising from inside me, some fragment of trauma breaking loose. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate, sweeping sound, the steady drag of bristles across a tiled floor. That sound had no place in an office building at 1 a.m, yet there it was measured, practiced, echoing faintly down the hallway. I froze, listening. The sweeping drew closer, slow, uninterrupted, like someone marking a line on the ground around my existence. I felt the cold thicken around me, rising along the back of my neck like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. And then, with a quiet click, the emergency lights flickered on. At the far end of the hall stood an elderly janitor. But she hadn't been there before, and there was no door on that side of the hallway she could have entered from. Her hair was pulled back into a loose knot, her posture slightly bent, her uniform dull with wear. She held a broom loosely in her hands, its bristles frayed, its handle smoothed by decades of touch. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anything. She swept in a slow arc around the exact place where I had been standing moments earlier. The movement so gentle it was almost ceremonial. I don't know how long I watched her, or how long my breath had been trapped in my throat, but when she finally turned her head toward me, her eyes were unfocused, clouded, yet somehow aware in the way an old house knows who belongs within its walls and who does not. When she spoke, her voice was not frail or tired. It was flat, matter of fact, like someone reciting old rules carved onto stone. "You're blocking my job." Nothing in her tone suggested annoyance. It was simply a statement of fact, a truth older than either of us. And when she stepped forward smoothly, with no sound except the smallest shuffle of her shoes, I stepped back without thinking. The corridor felt narrower with every inch I retreated, as though the walls had decided to close slightly, forcing me to move faster. Her steps did not quicken. They didn't need to. Something in her presence made the air around me feel thinner, harder to breathe, as if she carried the weight of a place I had trespassed on without meaning to understand its rules. I blinked once, and she was suddenly closer. I blinked again, and she was gone. No footsteps, no fading sweep of her broom, no door shutting somewhere behind me, only the stillness of a building that had been empty for hours. I ran. Not out of fear of ghosts, I've never believed in them, but because something inside me, something primal, understood that whatever I had seen was not a hallucination, not stress, not imagination. It was a threshold, a warning, a presence that had stepped out of silence to remind me that some debts remain uncollected because something older, quieter, and far more patient is standing guard. And as I burst into the cold night air, gasping, the wooden figurine burned hot in my pocket as if the night itself had fingers. I didn't sleep that night, though I tried, God knows I tried, to lie still long enough for exhaustion to drag me into oblivion. but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the janitor's blurred silhouette leaning into the emergency light, sweeping around my body as if outlining the shape of a crime scene no one had yet discovered. I lay awake, listening to the hum of my apartment's old radiator, the kind of restless hum that fills empty rooms with the suggestion of a presence that isn't really there. And yet, in those hours before dawn, the sound felt strangely synchronized with the pounding in my chest, as if the building and my heartbeat were conspiring to keep me awake. I replayed every second of the encounter, the darkness swallowing the office, the sweeping rhythm that seemed to follow the cadence of my breath, the simple phrase, "You're blocking my job." It didn't feel like a reprimand. It felt like a verdict, and the more I thought about it, the more a certain realization coiled inside me, cold and undeniable. Whatever that woman was, she hadn't been sweeping dirt. She had been sweeping space-tracing boundaries, reminding me that I had crossed into something I was never meant to touch. By morning, the wooden figurine still sat on my kitchen table where I had thrown it hours earlier, its carved surface catching the weak winter light that seeped through my blinds. The figure's expression, once humorous in a college kid kind of way, now seemed almost severe. I approached it slowly, half expecting the wood to still be warm, but when I touched it, the surface was cool, inert, as if nothing had happened the night before, and yet something inside me resisted picking it up again. My fingertips barely grazed the carved base before withdrawing, instinctively recoiling as though the figurine were a live wire I had once been shocked by. I didn't like that reaction. I didn't like how easily fear twisted common sense. But I've learned over the years that the body remembers danger long after the mind tries to forget it, and whatever force had intervened in the past during the night I almost killed, Daniel seemed to cling to this little wooden object like a fingerprint left by something that had no hand. I left the apartment earlier than usual, hoping fresh air or daylight or the mindless routine of work would ground me, give me something solid to stand on before the unsettled thoughts in my head took root. The streets were half awake, the kind of gray morning where everything looks washed out and reluctant, as if the world hasn't yet decided whether it wants to participate in another day. Cars crawled along the intersections, their headlights blending into the fog rising from sewer grates. And for a moment I thought I saw the outline of a broom handle in the mist, thin, angled, impossibly straight. But it vanished when I blinked. I forced myself to keep walking. The mind plays tricks when guilt loosens its grip enough to let imagination seep in, and I had too much to do that day to indulge whatever lingering paranoia was hitching a ride behind my ribs. Work should have distracted me, but it didn't. My office felt heavier than usual, as though the walls had absorbed the leftover tension from the previous night and were now exhaling it back at me in slow, suffocating waves. I briefed my team, reviewed incoming cases, listened to complaints from clients who owed more than they wanted to admit, but through all of it, I could not shake the memory of the sweeping sound echoing inside Daniel's office, because the truth is, it wasn't the apparition that frightened me. I've faced worse. I felt knives in my hand and blood on my skin and the dreadful calm that descends when anger blinds rationality. What terrified me was how familiar it all felt. How deeply the feeling of being stopped, intercepted, resonated with that night 3 years ago. The shove I couldn't explain, the weight on my wrist, the impossibility of finishing what I had begun. No human had been there then. No human had touched me, but something had, and that's what I tried not to remember. Because if I acknowledged that something had intervened once, then I had to accept that something could intervene again. That whatever force I had brushed against, whatever presence had marked the boundary between murder and restraint, had never really left. It had simply waited, watched, followed, and last night, in an empty building where I intended to steal and perhaps indulge in the fantasy of confrontation, it spoke again, not with words, not directly, but with a message that resonated more deeply than any threat. Your past isn't dead, and neither is your debt. By afternoon, I found myself standing in front of Daniel's building once more, drawn back not by obligation, but by a compulsion I could neither articulate nor suppress. The lobby looked different in daylight, ordinary, sterile, the kind of place where people shuffle through their lives without ever noticing the flicker of light above them or the slight echo of their footsteps on polished floors. But I noticed everything. The faint scent of cleaning solution lingering at the base of the stairwell, the way the elevator doors closed, a fraction slower than usual, the thin line of dust near the security desk that hadn't been there the night before. And as I waited for the elevator, I felt the wooden figurine's absence in my pocket, as though part of me had left a piece of itself behind on my kitchen table. I told myself I just wanted to confirm last night hadn't been a hallucination, that the janitor was real, that the sweeping wasn't some auditory trick born of stress. But when the elevator doors opened and the empty car reflected my distorted face back at me, I felt something colder, the suspicion that I hadn't simply encountered a wandering spirit or an overworked custodian. I had encountered a gatekeeper, someone or something that guards thresholds, not places, that intervenes not to punish, but to balance, that steps forward only when a person approaches a line they should not cross. And 3 years ago, I had crossed that line with a knife in my hand and betrayal burning white-hot in my veins. Walking down the hallway toward Daniel's office, the fluorescence above me buzzed with a low, angry hum, the kind of sound that reminds you electricity is a force barely contained, willing to lash out when stability falters. I reached his office door and placed a hand on the cool metal of the doorknob, half expecting it to burn or resist or pulse with the same strange heat I had felt from the figurine. But it didn't. The door opened easily, revealing the empty room exactly as I had left it, except the air felt heavier, thicker, as though someone had been inside minutes before. The chair was slightly angled away from the desk. The blind shifted even though no window was open, and the faintest trace of dust hovered in the air, suspended above the carpet like ash that had not yet decided where to fall. I stepped inside slowly, every nerve in my body tightening with that familiar vibration, the same vibration that had followed me out of prison, through 2 months of freedom, and into the cold office last night. Guilt doesn't fade. It transforms. It becomes atmospheric, seeping into the corners of rooms, into the cracks of your conscience, into the spaces where silence grows teeth. And in that office, surrounded by objects that belonged to the man who shattered my life, I felt guilt and rage intertwine into something almost ceremonial, something that wasn't finished with me yet. And then I noticed the broom. It leaned against the corner, old, wooden, bristles worn, but there had been no broom there the night before. And as I stared at it, a single truth descended on me with the weight of inevitability. I hadn't been invited into that building to collect a debt. I had been summoned by the night, summoned by the past, summoned back toward the threshold where something had once prevented me from becoming a murderer. And this time, whatever that something was, it wanted me to remember exactly why it stopped me. There are moments in a man's life when space behaves strangely, when the air around him seems to inhale before he does, as if the room itself is preparing to witness something it has long anticipated. And that was the feeling that wrapped itself around me the second I turned off the lights in Daniel's office that night. A hush so complete it felt arranged, deliberate. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until you begin to hear your own pulse as something foreign and intrusive. I remember the click of the switch, the soft surrender of the overhead lights, and then the sudden bloom of darkness that seemed less like an absence and more like a presence stepping forward, filling every inch of the room in a way that felt too thick to breathe through. I stood there for a moment, expecting my eyes to adjust, but the dark refused to thin. It clung to me like damp cloth, heavy and intimate, and in that stifling blackness I became aware of a new sound, impossibly slow and measured, the dry whisper of a broom dragging across the floor at the far end of the hallway. At first I thought it was a trick of memory or imagination, some leftover echo from cleaning staff earlier that evening, but the sound grew clearer, closer, impossibly steady, as if someone were sweeping not dust but time itself, smoothing the edges of a space the way a craftsman might plane a block of wood. My breath shallowed, the hair along my arms lifted, and with every gentle stroke of that broom, the dark around me seemed to tighten like a closing fist. I opened the office door because some foolish part of me believed the corridor would be brighter, that the emergency lights would be humming with the usual sickly green glow, but the hallway was drenched in the same devouring blackness, except for one faint, trembling light near the far corner, a cold, pale strip of illumination that looked less like it belonged to the building and more like it had seeped in from someplace else. The sweeping continued, unbroken, its rhythm so calm it became unsettling. Not a sound of labor, but of ritual. I stepped forward because I didn't know what else to do, because standing still felt like drowning in the dark. And as I moved into the hallway, I saw her, an elderly janitor, or at least the shape of one, standing in that thin slice of light, with her back slightly hunched, her shoulders narrow beneath a faded uniform, her broom moving in slow arcs that never faltered or paused. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge me. She simply swept the floor like someone performing a task she had been assigned centuries ago, her movements steady in a way that made the air around her shiver. For a moment I thought she was just a woman doing her job, someone who had worked the night shift too long and allowed routine to swallow whatever fragments of life she had left. But then, she shifted her weight in a way that felt wrong, as if her joints didn't quite belong where they were, as if her body had been assembled from memory rather than flesh, and the sweeping pause just for a heartbeat, as though she sensed me not with sight, but with some deeper, older sense of intrusion. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My voice lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs as she slowly turned her head, not with the stiffness of age, but with a smoothness that made my throat tighten. Her eyes met mine, or rather, her face angled toward me, her eyes cloudy and unfocused like someone staring through layers of fog rather than at the person in front of them, and yet the weight of her attention hit me like a cold hand pressing against the center of my chest. I felt exposed, as if the dark behind me were peeling back my history, revealing every moment I had tried to bury, every violent impulse I had pretended no longer lived inside me. She did not blink. She did not startle. She simply stood there gripping her broom with fingers too long, too thin, and when she finally spoke, her voice scraped through the silence like a dull blade dragged across stone, flat and motionless, carrying neither threat nor comfort, only inevitability. "You're blocking my job." It wasn't a reprimand. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of fact, delivered the same way a judge might read the final line of a sentence already carved into law. And the hallway felt narrower then, as if the walls had leaned in closer to hear her speak, as if the building itself had been waiting for that moment. I stepped back without meaning to, my heel skidding slightly on the carpet, and in that split second of imbalance I felt a shift in the air as if something moved just behind me, something I couldn't see but could sense pressing close, watching me with a patience that felt immense and impersonal. The janitor took a single step forward. It was not a step made by human weight. It made no sound, disturbed no fibers of the carpet, created no movement of air. It was simply a displacement, a sliding forward of presence rather than body, and I felt an instinctive panic knot itself in my stomach because every muscle in me understood that if she reached me, something irreversible would happen, not death, not violence, but recognition. The kind that severs a man from whatever lies he uses to keep his conscience quiet. I backed into Daniel's office doorway, the cold of the metal frame biting through my shirt. But when I blinked, she was already closer, her features softened by the trembling emergency light, until her face seemed less like a face and more like an impression left behind by decades of repetition. I blinked again, and she was gone, gone completely. No fading footsteps. No lingering echo of her broom, no sigh of displaced air. The hallway was empty, save for the thin tremble of the emergency light and the distant hum of something deeply mechanical, like a generator exhaling through the bones of the building. My breath came back in a ragged burst, my hands shaking with the kind of tremor that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden absence of something that should not have been there to begin with. I told myself to move, to get out, to leave the building before the dark gathered itself again, but a strange heaviness anchored my feet for several seconds, an almost gravitational pull urging me to stay, to listen, to understand. And in that suspended moment, I heard it, a brief, almost delicate sigh coming from the space I had just vacated, a sigh not of exhaustion but of disappointment, as if something unseen had stepped forward to finish its task only to find me already retreating across the threshold. I fled then, down the hallway, down the stairs, out of the lobby where the fluorescent lights flickered with an anxious pulse as I passed beneath them. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and clarifying, But even as I gulped in deep breaths, I felt the lingering weight of what I had encountered pressing against me from behind, as though the janitor had not vanished, but simply stepped back into the invisible world she maintained, waiting for the next transgression, the next intrusion, the next night someone attempted to cross a boundary without understanding what lay on the other side. And as I stood alone on the pavement, with my heartbeat still skittering out of rhythm, I realized something unsettling, something that wrapped itself around my spine with a cold familiarity. The janitor had not come because I was stealing data or trespassing in an office that didn't belong to me. She had come because I had carried something into that building, something violent, old, and unresolved. She had sensed the echo of the night I almost killed Daniel, the lingering intention that still clung to me like a stain. She did not guard the building. She guarded the threshold of consequence, of restraint, of justice twisted by betrayal. She had shown herself because I had awakened the same impulse that once brought me to the edge of murder, and she was not finished with me. For the rest of the day, the world moved around me with the indifferent rhythm of traffic lights and office doors and voices that never quite touched the bone, but I felt detached from all of it, as if someone had placed a thin sheet of glass between me and the rest of humanity. People walked past me in the street, their faces blurred by their own concerns, yet each time a figure passed too close, I felt the faintest chill drag across my shoulder, a reminder of the distance between me and normal life, a distance carved deeper by the ghostly encounter the night before. I tried to bury myself in work, flipping through files with trembling hands, but every paper I touched seemed to whisper a single truth. I was spiraling back towards something I had never finished. It wasn't Daniel's debt. It wasn't revenge. It was the night itself, the unfinished shape of a moment where a life had nearly ended under my hands, and where something unseen had intervened to keep the balance. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more the memory of that night pressed against me from behind, like a hand between my shoulder blades gently nudging me toward a door I had locked but never sealed. By the time evening fell, I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. The walls felt too narrow, too observant, as if the darkness gathering in the corners contained a quiet breath waiting for me to acknowledge it. I left without knowing where I was going, walking through streets that grew steadily emptier as the night deepened, the glow of street lamps pooling in irregular shapes on the wet pavement. There was a heaviness to the air, the kind that comes before snow or confession, and my boots echoed louder than they should have, bouncing back at me with a hollow quality that suggested the world had stepped away, giving me room to face something I was not ready to meet. I found myself drifting without intention, my feet carrying me through familiar intersections, until I realized where I was headed. Not Daniel's office, not the site of my own betrayal, but the block where he now lived, a narrow brick building with small windows that glowed faintly from inside, like hollowed-out shells containing borrowed warmth. I stopped across the street, staring up at the second-floor window where his living room used to be, the same room where 3 years earlier I had stood, with a knife raised, and a heart too full of rage to hear anything except the roaring in my head. I don't know how long I stood there, watching that window as if waiting for it to speak. My breath fogged in the air, curling upward like incense from an altar I had never meant to build. On the other side of the glass, I glimpsed shadows, nothing more than ordinary movements of a man preparing his dinner or setting his coat aside, but each silhouette felt intimately connected to a version of me I no longer wanted to remember. I could feel the knife again, its weight, the quiver in my wrist, the hot throb behind my eyes, and then something shifted behind me, a subtle displacement of air, the softest hum of motion, and my entire body tensed. I didn't turn immediately. I simply closed my eyes because I already knew. I could feel her before I saw her. That faint scent of dust and cold tiles, that pressure like a tide rising through the floor. The janitor, or whatever she truly was, she had found me again. When I finally turned my head, she stood half-lit beneath the yellow street lamp, her broom angled against her shoulder, her expression unchanged from the night before. Not anger, not judgment, but a curious kind of patience, as though she had been waiting for me to reach this street, this block, this precise fragment of my own past. She didn't move toward me. She didn't need to. Her presence alone altered the space between us, stretching it, tightening it, making the night feel suddenly ordered according to rules I did not understand. I took a step back because instinct demanded distance, but the pavement beneath my feet felt strangely elastic, as if the ground itself resisted letting me retreat. She tilted her head with a slowness that made my pulse throb painfully, and though her eyes were clouded, unfocused, I felt seen in a way that stripped layers off me: rage, guilt, denial, until only the raw truth remained. Trembling beneath the skin, I whispered one word into the cold. Why? It slipped out before I could choke it back. A pathetic, human question aimed at something far older and less sentimental than grief. And though she did not respond with sound, something shifted in the silence around us, a deepening, a downward pull like the first moment of sinking into water. It wasn't an answer, but an invitation, or perhaps a command. The streetlight above her flickered once, twice, and then steadied, and in the thin shimmer of that wavering glow I realized she wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, toward the window where Daniel's shadow moved inside his warm apartment, oblivious to the cold shape of the night gathering around him. Memory is a cruel director. It illuminates moments you wish would stay buried. And as I followed her gaze toward Daniel's window, I felt the night 3 years ago unfold again beneath my feet. I saw myself standing in his kitchen, fingers clenched around the knife, rage so bright it eclipsed reason. I heard the noise of the struggle, the choke of breath, the collapse of trust, and I felt again viscerally, unmistakably, the shove from behind that saved his life, the weight that dragged my wrist downward, the invisible restraint that kept the knife from plunging deeper. And with a sickening clarity, I knew that the force that had stopped me then was the same force that stood before me now. She hadn't been in the kitchen that night. She hadn't appeared in any form I could see. But her presence, this ancient, unsettling presence, had filled the room like an unseen witness refusing to let an irreversible act occur. The car passed down the street, its headlights slicing through the shadows, but the beams did not reflect in her eyes. They passed through her, or around her, or perhaps the light simply obeyed her boundary. The realization that she might not be a ghost, at least not in the human sense, sent a cold shudder through me. She felt more like a custodian, not of buildings, but of balance, of thresholds, of the exact fine line between harm intended and harm fulfilled. And if she had come for me now, outside Daniel's home, it meant one thing. I had crossed that line again in my thoughts, if not my actions. The night had returned to test me. I turned away from her because I couldn't face the weight of her presence any longer. But when I took my first step down the sidewalk, the shadows along the building seemed to lengthen, bending toward me in slow, deliberate stretches, as if the night itself were reaching out to keep pace. I walked faster, my breath growing unsteady, my mind replaying every moment of violence I had tried to bury. And with every step, I felt her behind me, not following, not pursuing, but accompanying, like the quiet sound of sweeping on a floor where no dirt exists. I don't know how far I walked before the world around me began to distort, the street stretching into an unfamiliar shape, the air thickening until each inhalation felt like drawing breath through wet cloth. The buildings dimmed, the street lamps flickered, and when the world finally settled again, I found myself standing in front of a place that should not have existed, a table. A long, narrow table set in the middle of the silent street, covered in a white cloth that stirred slightly, though there was no wind. The table was empty except for a single wooden figurine, the same one I had left on my kitchen table that morning, placed neatly at its center, facing me with its carved eyes darkened by shadow. No people sat at the table. No voices rose from the chairs. Yet the air throbbed with the unmistakable sensation of an audience, a gathering, a banquet of unseen witnesses, assembled not to eat, but to judge. And I knew then, with a certainty deeper than fear, that the night had brought me here not to punish me, but to make me remember. The table stretched before me in a way that defied ordinary space, its length disproportionate to the narrow street, as though the night had unfolded itself just enough to make room for something older than the asphalt beneath my feet. The white cloth draped over it did not ripple with the breeze, because there was no breeze. The air was thick and unmoving, as if the world had paused in a single held breath. The wooden figurine sat at the center like a placeholder for a host who had not yet arrived. but even from several feet away I could feel its weight, not physical but moral, the kind of gravity that gathers around objects connected to sins that were never fully judged. I approached slowly, feeling the ground soften beneath each step, not physically, but perceptually, the same way memory distorts the texture of a place when you revisit it with a heart that has changed. The streetlights dimmed as I neared the table, the shadows elongating into a ring around me, forming something like a quiet audience, and with every inch I moved, the sweeping sound returned not behind me, not ahead, but everywhere at once, like a soft exhale from the night itself, reminding me that I had not come here by accident. I had been summoned, called to a place that existed only between guilt and consequence, a banquet without food or guests, set for a single man who had spent 3 years trying to convince himself his crimes were behind him. I stopped at the edge of the table, staring at the wooden figurine, its carved features catching what little light remained. The shape was simple, almost childish, and yet in that moment it looked impossibly solemn. A token of a friendship I had ruined long before the blade ever touched my hand. I reached out, not knowing why, and the moment my fingers brushed the wood, the air around me thickened, the shadows contracting like pupils focusing on something they had waited years to see. I felt the ground tilt, not literally, but in a way that made my stomach drop, as if the world had suddenly adjusted its balance around me. My breath caught. The night shifted. And then I wasn't alone. They didn't appear as ghosts. Not the way stories like to exaggerate, not as transparent shapes or flickering silhouettes. They appeared as impressions, as disturbances in the air across the other seats along the table, like figures drawn in smoke, suggestions of bodies leaning forward, heads bowed, chairs creaking under invisible weight. I knew instantly that these were not people. They were not spirits in the sense of souls clinging to the living world. They were echoes of consequence, embodiments of the moment of violence that had almost rewritten my life entirely. They were the witnesses the world offers only when justice fails to resolve itself, and whether they were real or constructs of my unraveling conscience didn't matter. Their presence felt undeniable, as if they had been waiting for me since the night Daniel's blood touched the floor. The janitor stood at the head of the table, though I hadn't seen her arrive. One moment her chair was empty, the next her faded outline anchored itself there, broom resting against her shoulder like a ceremonial staff. She didn't move, she didn't speak, yet everything around her bent inward slightly, as if the night recognized her authority. If she had eyes beneath the clouded veil of her gaze, they were fixed on me. And in that oppressive silence I felt every lie I had told myself peel away, leaving me exposed in a way prison never had. I thought I had confronted my guilt already. Thought 3 years of confinement had forced me to face what I almost did, but standing here, under the weight of a night that had shaped itself into a courtroom without walls, I realized I had never truly accepted responsibility. I had blamed betrayal, fury, impulse. I had blamed the circumstances, the affair, the collapse of trust, but I had never looked directly at the part of myself that had wanted Daniel to die. The sweeping sound resumed, slow, patient, intimate, and I felt it brushing against the back of my neck, a reminder of a force that had intervened once, a force that had kept me from becoming something irreversible. The janitor shifted slightly, her outline sharpening just enough for me to see the curve of her jaw, the faint impression of lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. I understood then that she wasn't here to condemn me. Her presence was not punitive. It was remedial, corrective. She had stopped me 3 years ago, not because she cared for Daniel or for me, but because the balance of things demanded it. Violence creates ripples that spread far beyond the moment of impact, and she had been there to keep the world from tipping too far in one direction. Tonight wasn't about stopping me. Tonight was about reminding me of the boundary I had crossed, and the debt that boundary now expected me to acknowledge. I lifted the figurine fully into my hands, feeling its weight settle into my palms as if it had been waiting for this moment. The wood was no longer cool. It was warm, pulsing faintly like a small animal breathing in sleep, and as I held it, memories surged, not flashes of violence, but muted fragments from long before the betrayal. Daniel and I joking in a college dorm, sharing drinks, promising loyalty, exchanging gifts without any sense of the catastrophe our futures would hold. I felt something tighten in my chest, a grief that wasn't for him or for myself, but for the version of us that had existed before life became sharp. The figurine grew heavier. The world around me grew quieter, and then a single thought rose within me, simple, painful, undeniable. I had come here seeking debt collection, but the only unpaid debt was mine. The janitor raised her broom not quickly, not threateningly, but with the solemnity of someone marking the end of a ceremony. The shadows around the table leaned in, their forms blurring as if dissolving back into the night that had created them. The air shifted with a sense of closure, a settling of accounts. I felt something release inside me, a tension I had carried so long I had forgotten it wasn't part of my body. It loosened slowly, like a knot unraveling beneath warm water, and for the first time in years my breath came without the thick weight of denial. I whispered an apology not to Daniel, not to the janitor, not even to the night, but to the version of myself I had failed. The air accepted it without sound. The shadows receded, and then the table vanished, not violently, not suddenly, but gently, dissolving into the dark like smoke in reverse, until nothing remained but an empty street and the faint glow of distant street lamps. The night felt ordinary again. The janitor was gone. The sweeping had stopped, and the wooden figurine lay on the asphalt at my feet, inert, no longer warm, no longer pulsing, just a piece of carved wood without judgment or power. I picked it up out of habit, turning it once in my hand, and though it felt no different than it had the day I gifted it to Daniel, I knew everything else had changed. The night had collected its due. The balance had been restored. And whatever force had intervened 3 years ago, whatever guardian had prevented me from finishing the act I now understood would have ruined more than one life, had offered me a final truth before withdrawing. Some debts are never repaid with vengeance or avoidance. Some must be repaid through understanding. As I walked home, the figurine's weight felt natural, familiar, almost comforting. I didn't see the janitor again. I didn't hear the sweeping. But more than once, in the thin quiet just before dawn, I felt as though someone had gently brushed a hand along the air behind me, guiding me toward the version of myself I might still become. Not a threat, not a haunting, just a presence, ensuring I did not cross the same threshold again. And in that subtle, almost tender touch of the unseen, I finally understood the title of the night's gathering. It was called a banquet, because the night had feasted on the last thing it needed from me, my unspoken truth. The mistimed summoning. The first thing I remember from that night wasn't the cold, or the darkness, or even the exhaustion humming behind my eyes like a low-voltage current. It was the way the highway kept stretching ahead of me, in a shape that didn't feel entirely real, the asphalt unfurling in long, unbroken ribbons beneath the trembling glow of distant street lamps that never seemed to grow closer, no matter how far I drove, as if the road itself were measuring my breath, waiting for me to misstep. I had been driving for hours in that second-hand compact sedan I had bought, with the little luck that ever found a man like me, $2,000 from a scratch-off ticket, enough for a vehicle old enough to groan when you pressed the brakes, but new enough that I called it a blessing. And yet that night, as the engine rattled beneath me with the stubborn persistence of a machine too tired to complain, I could not shake the feeling that I had wandered into a stretch of road that did not belong entirely to the living, that some boundary between here and elsewhere had thinned around my wheels, letting the night seep closer to me than it usually dared. My father was dying. That was what had dragged me from the construction site in the provincial capital and thrown me onto the road before the sun even finished collapsing behind the cranes. A heart attack, they said. Sudden, severe, the kind of call no son receives without something in him breaking open. I remember gripping the steering wheel with knuckles so tight they hurt, telling myself over and over that if I drove fast enough, well enough, straight enough, I would reach him in time, that he would see me walk through the door and recognize me, not as a laborer or a disappointment or a son too far from home, but simply as someone who came back when needed. But the truth was, my driving had always been poor. I could pour concrete smoother than most men and lift steel beams without flinching. Yet, give me a car, and I became a trembling student again, clumsy with the gas pedal. too cautious on curves, too tense on straightaways. And fatigue, that creeping thief of judgment, had already begun to settle behind my eyelids like wet sand. The night deepened as I approached the toll station, its fluorescent canopy rising from the dark like the ribs of some skeletal creature sunken halfway into the earth, each panel humming with the weak light that flickered against the cold air. My legs cramped the moment I pulled up to the booth, a sharp, sudden spasm climbing from my calf to my hip, and the pain forced me to stop the car crookedly, one wheel rolling over the faded lane divider. I tried stretching my foot, but the cramp held fast, blooming into a numbness that threatened to crawl up my spine. And for a moment the world blurred, smeared by the tiredness that had accumulated in me like a slow-moving tide. I might have cried out if the window beside me hadn't slid open just then, letting in a breath of air tinged with something soft and warm, vanilla, or maybe jasmine. And when I turned, she was there, the toll attendant. I didn't know her name then, didn't know anything except that she stood framed by the dim booth light like a painting someone had forgotten to take down. Her features gentle yet oddly vivid against the gloom, her eyes bright in a way that felt too steady for the late hour. She asked if I was all right, her voice low and even, not the bored monotone of attendants who count change until sunrise, but a tone that carried something like concern, or expectation, or recognition. Before I could answer, she was already stepping out of the booth, bending gracefully beside the car door, her hand on my leg with a confidence that should have startled me but instead sent a wave of relief through the cramped muscle. She pressed her thumb into the knot of pain, and the pressure unwound the spasm instantly, as if she had done this for me before. The fog in my mind lifted just enough for gratitude to emerge, and when she smiled, small, almost shy, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not romantic, not lustful, but a quiet awareness that I was no longer alone on the road. Her name was Linlin. She told me that gently, almost as if she wanted to make sure I knew how to say it later. She asked where I was going, and when I told her about my father, her expression didn't shift in the way most people's do when they hear of a dying parent. She simply nodded once, slowly, sympathetically, as if acknowledging not the tragedy but the inevitability. Then she asked if I could take her a little way down the road, just past the toll station to her home, explaining the buses had stopped early due to maintenance. I should have questioned it why someone so composed, so striking, so seemingly out of place in a small-town toll booth would need a ride from a stranger in a battered old car, but exhaustion makes men agreeable, and grief makes them grateful for company. She slid into the passenger seat with a fluidity that made the old door seem too clumsy for her, and as we pulled back onto the road, the cab filled with the faint scent of her perfume, mixing with the cold breath of winter creeping through the vents. For several miles we drove in silence, the kind that doesn't weigh or grate but wraps itself around you like a blanket on a night when your bones ache from worry. The headlights cut through the darkness in a narrow ribbon, illuminating patches of frost that glimmered like scattered shards of glass, and the world outside the windshield felt suspended, as if the car were moving through a tunnel of nothingness rather than an actual highway. Linlin watched the road ahead without speaking, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, and though I could see her clearly in the dim interior light, something about her features seemed to shift when I looked directly at her, as if the edges softened when I glanced sideways but sharpened into crisp detail only when I wasn't paying attention. I dismissed it as fatigue. I dismissed a lot of things that night. Eventually, she pointed toward a massive building rising from the roadside, a restaurant with a glowing sign and looping cursive letters that read, "All are welcome," though one of the bulbs in the first word flickered erratically, making the message pulse in a way that unsettled me. She suggested we stop so I could eat something before continuing, insisting that no son should face a dying father on an empty stomach. I wanted to argue, but the truth was my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, my eyelids dragging, the road beneath us beginning to sway in a way that suggested my body had reached the limit of what urgency could sustain. I pulled into the parking lot, grateful for the chance to stretch, and as we walked toward the entrance, I glanced to the side and saw something that stopped my breath for the briefest second. A wrecked car, identical to mine, crumpled at the front, windshield shattered, headlights blinking weakly like the dying eyes of an animal. I blinked. The car vanished, The lot was empty except for my own vehicle. I told myself the fatigue was playing tricks, that reflections and shadows conspire easily under tired eyes. But when I looked at Linlin, she was already watching me with an expression too calm, too understanding, as if she had expected me to see something, as if the night had only just begun revealing its truth. And as we stepped into the restaurant's warm, amber-lit interior, I felt a strange certainty settle into me, the kind of certainty that hums quietly beneath panic that the road behind me had already ended, and I simply hadn't understood it yet. The moment we stepped inside the restaurant, I felt the temperature shift in a way that didn't make sense. Not warmer or colder exactly, but displaced, as if the air here had been sitting too long without anything breathing it, the way a sealed room feels when you first open it after years stale, motionless, and heavy with a faint sweetness that reminded me of fruit left out overnight. The lighting was soft and golden, almost too golden, the chandeliers above casting a glow that flattened shadows rather than shaping them, and for a moment I wondered if the bulbs were tinted or if the room itself exhaled this amber hue. There were tables lining the space, polished and neatly set, each with a white tablecloth, silver cutlery, and empty glasses that caught the light in sharp glints, but not a single person sat at any of them. The silence felt padded, thick, as though sound might sink into the carpet instead of traveling. Linlin walked ahead of me with quiet confidence, her steps barely audible, and though she looked perfectly at ease, the hairs along my arms lifted. Something about the emptiness felt rehearsed, as if the room had been waiting for us rather than abandoned. A waiter appeared almost instantly, not from the kitchen or from a side door, but from the far corner, as though he had been standing there all along, unnoticed until he decided to move. His uniform was spotless, pressed so perfectly it looked like it had been ironed onto him. He smiled politely, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and when I looked directly at his face, the contours seemed slightly blurred, edges too soft, as if he were out of focus, despite standing only a few steps away. He gestured us to a table near the center of the room and pulled out a chair for Linlin with a motion that felt memorized rather than practiced, the way an animatronic figure might mimic hospitality without understanding it. I sat opposite her, and the waiter placed 2 menus in front of us, though neither of us opened them. The silence stretched until he retreated in a glide rather than a walk, his steps soundless, his shoulders unmoving, vanishing into the same far corner he had emerged from. As he disappeared, I caught a glimpse of the side of his head, too flat, too pale, too still, and for a moment I had the inexplicable impression that his profile resembled paper rather than skin. I tried to shake it off. Fatigue does strange things to perception, and my stomach growled with a sudden intensity that embarrassed me. I hadn't eaten since before sunrise, and the weight of worry had hollowed me out. Linlin watched me with an expression softer than before, as though she found something endearing about my hunger. She poured me a glass of water from the pitcher waiting on the table, but when the liquid hit the glass, it rippled strangely, not the way water reacts to motion, but as if something beneath the surface had sighed. She encouraged me to drink, her voice gentle but insistent, and I took a sip that tasted colder than ice, colder than anything should be that had been sitting in a warm room. It numbed my tongue slightly, and when I set the glass down, I could swear the water inside stilled faster than water should, settling in a perfect level plane. The waiter returned, this time carrying a bottle of white liquor with a label I didn't recognize. He poured it for me without asking, and Linlin urged me to drink to warm my muscles and clear the road's exhaustion. Her smile bright, but her eyes unreadable. I shouldn't have drunk it. God knows I shouldn't have. But the combined weight of worry, fatigue, gratitude, and the surreal ambiance of the room made resistance feel unnecessary, almost rude. The liquor burned in my throat, then spread through my chest like something alive, loosening the coiled stress in my muscles. I felt a wave of relief so sudden and soothing it made my breath hitch. Linlin clapped her hands once in gentle approval, and the waiter bowed, not a polite nod, but a full, old-fashioned bow that felt ritualistic rather than respectful. As the warmth washed through me, the room began to shift, not dramatically, not like the world spinning, but subtly, like the edges of reality softening. The chandelier lights shimmered with slow pulses, as if dimming and brightening in time with a heartbeat I couldn't locate. The empty tables no longer felt empty. There was an impression of presence, like the faint pressure you sense when someone is standing behind you before they speak. The waiter moved among the tables, but his movements were no longer glides, they were more like jerks. Small mechanical corrections, as if adjusting to a rhythm he couldn't maintain. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the harder I tried, the more things slipped into that strange, uncanny half-focus. At some point, the room no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, not visibly, not in any way I could point to, but the atmosphere thickened. The silence became layered, charged, as if filled with the quiet weight of unspoken conversations. And then the people appeared, not suddenly, not with any dramatic entrance, but gradually, as though emerging from behind a veil my eyes had finally learned to see through. An elderly man sat at the table nearest our own, his back bent, his face slack, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. A younger man lounged several tables away, but his posture was wrong, his spine curved inward, his neck tilted at an angle no living person would find comfortable. A middle-aged woman sat near the entrance, her head turned toward me but her gaze unfocused, the pupils dull, foggy. I stared, unable to look away, and slowly, horribly, I realized none of them were breathing. Linlin continued talking in a soft, reassuring voice, asking about my father, my work, my village, as though nothing in the room had changed. But her voice had an echo now, not a real echo, but a hollow quality, as if I were hearing her from inside a tunnel. I tried to steady my hands, but the liquor seemed to thicken in my blood, making motion sluggish. I blinked at the old man again, and this time I noticed the edges of his hands jagged, frayed, like paper soaked and dried again. The woman near the door seemed wrinkled, not with age, but with some kind of creasing, as if her skin had been folded, pressed, and unfolded. When the young man lifted his arm, it bent unnaturally, elbow bending inward instead of outward, for a brief, disorienting moment, before snapping back into place. My breath hitched again, but this time not from relief. Linlin leaned forward and told me to drink a little more, said it would help the dizziness, help the tension in my shoulders, help the road feel farther behind me. But her face now had an odd quality, not blurry, not distorted, but too perfect, like a portrait painted with careful strokes rather than a living face made of pores and breath. She looked like herself, yet she looked like a memory of herself. I set the glass down without drinking, and it made a sound far too loud for such a gentle motion, the noise reverberating through the room like a distant bell being struck underwater. Then, the staring began, not from Linlin, not from the waiter, from the others, one by one, the elderly man, the young man, the wrinkled woman, and dozens of others who had been seated in the growing crowd turned their faces toward me, slowly, heavily, with the deliberateness of bodies moved by puppeteer strings, their dead, dull eyes fixed on me with expressions not of accusation but of expectation, as if I were the final piece they had been waiting for, as if my arrival completed some ritual they had set long before I walked in. Their mouths did not move, their bodies did not shift. Only their eyes held me, pinning me to the chair as surely as if chains had wrapped around my wrists. My pulse hammered in panic, the liquor now sickening rather than soothing, and I tried to stand, but my legs felt disconnected from my mind, heavy, numb, as though the cramp from earlier had returned but magnified beyond comprehension. Linlin watched me calmly, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression soft but unreadable, and she did not look at the crowd around us. She didn't need to. She knew they were there. She had expected them. My vision swam, the room warping into a tunnel of amber light and motionless faces. I leaned forward, trying to breathe, and then the cold hit me an icy blast from below the table, rising like a tide, swallowing my knees, my thighs, my chest. The cold so intense it erased thought. I slipped from the chair, collapsing onto the floor as the world dimmed around the edges. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me was a waiter standing inches from my face, his paper-thin cheek wrinkling as he dipped his head in what looked like a greeting, and then everything went black. When consciousness returned, it did not come with the gentle ascent of waking, but with a jolt, the way a drowning man might lunge toward the surface, desperate for a breath he is no longer sure he remembers how to take. At first I did not know where I was. All I could register was the unbearable cold clinging to my clothes, the hardness of the floor pressing into my ribs, and a chorus of sounds around me, a dim murmur of voices, the clatter of dishes, the shifting of chairs that suggested a room filled with life, even though the chill running along my skin felt unmistakably like the airlessness of a tomb. My eyes struggled to adjust, vision wavering between blurs of gold and shadows, until shapes finally assembled themselves into something coherent. I was still in the restaurant, but the quiet emptiness that greeted me earlier had been replaced by a bustling scene, or the illusion of one, as though the room had awakened in a different time, a different state of being, while I had been unconscious. The chandeliers above glowed brighter now, their amber light reflecting off every surface, and the tables were no longer pristine or deserted. They were occupied by figures dressed in outdated clothing suits from decades past, dresses that looked handmade, fabrics stiff and dull, colors muted to gray, and all of them appeared engaged in lively conversation. Yet when I listened closely, their mouths did not move. The voices I heard did not belong to their bodies. It was as if sound had been poured into the room from some unseen source, filling the space with borrowed noise to hide the fact that nothing here was truly alive. I pushed myself up slowly, my joints stiff, my breath coming in uneven shivers. The people, if they could be called that, did not acknowledge me. They continued eating food that wasn't there, lifting utensils that never touched their lips, performing the motions of dining with the repetitive artificiality of mannequins animated by a shaky puppeteer. The air carried no scent of cooking, no warmth from kitchens, only that stale sweetness, that faint trace of something preserved. I tried to stand fully, but the moment I placed weight on my feet, a wave of dizziness swelled behind my eyes, forcing me to grip the table beside me for support. My hand sank into the fabric of the tablecloth, and the texture felt wrong, too smooth, too cold, like the surface of laminated paper pretending to be cloth. When I pulled my hand away, the impression of my fingers lingered longer than it should have. I looked toward the chair where Linlin had been sitting earlier, but it was empty. The seat was pushed in neatly, as though she had never been there at all. A flicker of panic rose in me, panic not just at her absence, but at the uncanny possibility that her presence tonight might have been as insubstantial as the waiter's blurred face, the paper-thin hands, the flickering patrons. I scanned the room for her, turning slowly, trying not to collapse, and for a moment I thought she truly was gone. Then I saw her by the far wall, standing perfectly still near a decorative shelf of porcelain vases, her back to me, her posture straight, her hair falling in a dark cascade as though untouched by even a whisper of movement in the room. There was something about the way she stood, too motionless, too composed, that made my chest tighten with apprehension. Before I could call out, she turned, and her expression softened with the same gentle warmth she had shown at the toll booth, the same serenity that had soothed me in the car, and yet in this new light, surrounded by this impossible scene, her calmness felt dissonant, like a smile held on a mask that was slowly cracking from behind. She walked toward me, footsteps silent, gliding more than stepping, and knelt beside where I struggled to remain upright. Without a word, she placed a hand on my shoulder, steadying me, and something in her touch felt both comforting and cold, as though her palm carried the memory of winter more than the warmth of living skin. She told me, with a softness that wrapped itself around my panic, that I had fainted from exhaustion and that the room must feel overwhelming after waking, but she spoke in a tone that suggested she expected this reaction, as though she had seen many others wake in many other rooms like this. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small round object, a mirror, encased in a frame of tarnished silver, the surface dulled with age. She held it up to my face, telling me gently that sometimes the mind sees clearer when given something familiar to anchor to. But even before the mirror reached my eye level, I felt a dread coil inside me, a silent instinct whispering that whatever I saw in that reflection would not be familiar at all. Still, I looked. The first thing I saw was my own face, pale, drained, shadows beneath my eyes deeper than they should have been, but behind me, in the blurred reflection of the restaurant, nothing matched what my bare eyes perceived. The lively room full of diners vanished in the reflection. Instead, The tables were surrounded by figures I had not noticed before. Corpses, each in various states of ruin, slumped over chairs, sprawled across tablecloths, seated rigidly upright, with limbs bent at impossible angles, dressed in the same outdated garments I had seen moments earlier. The elderly man whose soft paper hands had unsettled me now appeared in the mirror with half his skull caved inward, dried blood streaking down his temple. The young man with the unnatural posture had a broken spine, twisted so severely that his torso folded over itself like a piece of cloth. The woman near the door, once merely dull-eyed, now bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had died in a violent collision. Her chest collapsed, her neck bent sharply, her face frozen mid-scream. I gasped, pulling the mirror away. But when I looked around the room directly, everything remained calm and curated. The diners composed and still, their faces blank rather than broken. I stared into the mirror again, my breath growing shallow, and the corpses stared back at me, their hollow eyes glinting faintly as if aware of being seen. And then, God help me, their heads began to turn toward me in unison, the motion slow, deliberate, their broken necks cracking in unnatural angles in the reflection while their real-world counterparts remained motionless. I watched, frozen by terror, as their mouths stretched open not in speech but in a silent scream, wide enough to tear the edges of their faces. Linlin closed her hand over mine, lowering the mirror before I could drop it. She told me quietly that reflections showed truth when the living eyes refused to see, and the way she said it made it clear that she wasn't speaking metaphorically. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't confused. She had expected me to witness this. Her gaze held mine, steady and calm, and for the first time I saw something behind that serenity. Not malice, not pity, but a kind of ancient resignation, as if she had long accepted the weight of truths that others only encountered in their final minutes. I managed to ask her, my voice hoarse, trembling, barely forming words, who these people were, what this place was, what was happening to me. But she didn't answer. Instead, she stood and offered me her hand, urging me to follow before the room fully awakened to my presence. The way she said it made my blood run cold, as if the illusion of calm around us was thinning and the reality beneath it was preparing to surface. She guided me toward the entrance, but as we walked, the diners, both the living illusions and their corpse reflections, seemed to shift subtly, turning ever so slightly in our direction, as though some collective attention had finally latched onto me, recognizing me not as an intruder but as something expected, anticipated. We reached the doorway, and as Linlin pushed it open, the restaurant's warmth evaporated instantly, replaced by a bitter wind that smelled of wet earth and something metallic. She told me not to look back, her voice firmer than before, and though I did not understand, I obeyed out of instinct rather than trust. The moment I stepped through the threshold, the floor beneath me seemed to vanish, replaced by a weightless empty space, as though the world had been stripped of gravity. My stomach lurched, my body suspended in a cold void, and for a heartbeat I felt as though I had fallen out of time altogether. Then the world reassembled itself in a rush of wind and darkness. We were no longer on the highway, no longer near the restaurant, no longer in any place a living man should be. And Linlin, standing beside me in the swirling gloom, whispered with a mixture of regret and inevitability that the mirror had not shown me ghosts. It had shown me the truth about myself. The darkness that swallowed us was not the kind born of night, not the simple absence of light that comes when the sun dips below the world, but a deeper, older kind of void, an expanse that felt vast yet suffocating, silent yet deafening, familiar yet entirely alien. The sensation of falling faded into one of drifting, as though my body had been unhooked from gravity and suspended in a space stitched together from fog and memory. Shapes moved at the edges of my sight, broad silhouettes, towering columns, arches carved from something that wasn't stone but remembered stone, dream stone, the kind of architectural echo you might glimpse in a half-formed dream before waking. The ground solidified beneath my feet without warning, a smooth surface that felt neither warm nor cold, neither hard nor soft, and the mist that curled around us parted just enough to reveal a structure rising in front of me. A colossal hall, its facade marked by symbols that seemed to shift every time I blinked. as though refusing to settle into any form associated with human language. Above its towering entrance hung a plaque heavy, ancient, weathered by forces unknown, and though I could not read the script etched into it, a meaning pressed itself into my mind with the inevitability of instinct. Eastern Management Department, not because I saw the words, but because something whispered them into my understanding, bypassing sight altogether. Linlin guided me forward with a steady hand at my back, her touch more confident now, less hesitant, as though returning to this place restored something in her posture. Her steps grew quieter still, almost reverent, and the closer we drew, the more the mist thickened behind us, sealing off any path we might have used to leave. I tried to speak, tried to ask where we were, what had happened in the restaurant, why the room had filled with corpses only in the mirror, but my voice felt smothered by the air, absorbed before it had a chance to fully exist, dissolving like breath on cold glass. Linlin seemed to sense the questions anyway, glancing at me with an expression that held neither deceit nor comfort but a profound sorrow, as though she knew that any explanation she offered would only lead me deeper into a truth I wasn't prepared to face. The doors to the hall opened before us without touch, sliding apart in a graceful arc that revealed an interior so immense it could not possibly fit within the structure's exterior walls. Rows upon rows of desks stretched into the distance, each manned by figures wearing robes of muted gray. Their faces were obscured, not hidden, not masked, simply blurred, smoothed by some veil that prevented features from forming. Some wrote on scrolls that glowed faintly with pale light. Others stamped documents with seals that emitted soft, resonant thuds, and others sifted through piles of tokens that looked like fragments of bone, each one glowing with a flicker of something like identity. The air hummed with activity, yet no sound emerged, no chatter, no footsteps, no rustle of paper, only a low, omnipresent vibration, like the collective heartbeat of a system older than time. We walked through the center aisle, and as we did, the workers paused not to look at me, for they had no eyes to turn, but to acknowledge Linlin with a subtle dip of their heads. A warmth flickered in her gaze each time, a recognition that hinted at her belonging here far more than she belonged at the toll booth where I had met her. The realization struck me slowly, painfully, that I had not met Linlin on the highway by chance. That encounter had been arranged, timed, orchestrated with precision. At the end of the hall stood a raised platform bathed in a soft light that seemed to emanate from beneath the floor. On it rested a table carved from some dark, shimmering material, and behind it stood a tall figure whose presence commanded the space in a way no voice ever could. His robe was darker than the others, almost black, and unlike the faceless workers, his features were visible, sharply defined, yet shadowed in a way that made them shift subtly as he moved. His eyes were deep, unreadable, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to balancing decisions between realms. His expression tightened when he saw me, not with surprise, but with an irritation tinged by guilt, as though he were confronted with a problem he had been hoping to delay. Linlin bowed her head slightly, and the man her father, I somehow knew before she even introduced him, returned the gesture with solemn authority. When she spoke, her voice layered itself over the stillness, strangely audible despite the silence that swallowed everything else. She explained that I had awoken sooner than expected, that the veil had thinned earlier than anticipated, that my arrival had been difficult. The man closed his eyes briefly, a sigh escaping him not through sound but through the shifting of his shoulders, and when he opened them again, he gazed at me with a mixture of scrutiny and resignation. He stepped closer and raised a hand. A ripple passed through the air, bending reality like heat over asphalt, and suddenly the floor beneath us became a window, not a metaphorical one, a literal window of swirling mist and fractured images, as though the ground had dissolved into a pool of memories. In its depths, I saw a familiar shape, my car driving through the darkness. I watched myself gripping the wheel with exhausted determination, blinking fiercely to stay awake. I saw the road ahead curve gently, and I saw my hand slip, just slightly, just enough. The front wheel dipped off the pavement. The car swerved. The entire scene skewed sideways as if the world itself had tilted. Then there was a crash not heard, but felt a burst of force, the violent shudder of impact, and a flood of darkness swallowing the vehicle whole. My breath caught in my throat. The image replayed, slower this time, cruelly clear. The moment of impact had happened while I sat in the restaurant, sipping cold liquor, watching the waiter glide between tables, while I thought I was still alive, still hungry, still hurrying home, while I believed Lin had joined me for companionship rather than duty. Her father spoke not aloud, but inside my mind, as if his voice traveled along a different plane. He told me the truth that tightened around my chest like an iron chain. I had died on the highway the moment exhaustion overpowered me. My car had veered off the road while my eyes were half shut, drifting into a shallow ditch hidden by winter shadows. The impact had been instant, fatal. There had been no pain, only the illusion of continuity crafted by a mind unwilling to let go, stretched like a thread between the last thought of the living and the first step into death. The restaurant had not been a restaurant. It had been a receiving station, a liminal holding space where wayward souls who died in disorientation were gathered, sheltered, observed. The diners had been those who died on roads, highways, intersections, the forgotten victims of winter nights, icy curves, reckless speed, or simple human fatigue. Their bodies had appeared intact in the illusory world, but the mirror had shown their true forms, the forms their spirits carried behind the veil. Lin had not been a toll booth worker but a guide, a psychopomp in training, assigned to bring wandering souls to the Eastern Management Department for processing. She had felt sympathy for me, that much her father admitted, but her duty had not been a lie. She had simply completed it, with gentleness. I stared into the swirling window again, and the final piece of truth revealed itself with devastating clarity. In the scene below, just after the crash, I saw Lin standing beside my wrecked car, her hand pressed lightly against the shattered window. She had reached me before anyone else. She had guided my spirit from the ruins before my consciousness fully dissolved. She had been waiting for me on the road, not because she needed a ride, but because she knew I would never make it home. My knees weakened, and the father motioned for the window to close, the mist folding back into the floor like a curtain drawn over the past. His expression softened, not with affection, but with a bureaucratic empathy shaped by centuries of watching lives unravel. He explained that my soul had been scheduled for retrieval tomorrow, not tonight. A clerical error, a misalignment in timing. Someone had misread a ledger, and my death had come earlier than expected. Because of that mistake, my arrival had caught the department off guard, and they now faced a choice: return me to the cycle unprocessed, risking disturbance in the living world, or authorize an early appointment to a vacant post in their ranks. Lin's eyes met mine, and for the first time since I had met her, fear flickered there, not fear of me, but fear for me. She knew what her father was suggesting before he said it. I knew too. The department was prepared to offer me a position, a role among their messengers, to correct their scheduling error by granting me purpose rather than oblivion, a guide between roads, a psychopomp for those who died unprepared just as I had. I felt the weight of the decision pressing through the silence, shaping the air, bending the future. And then her father spoke the words that sealed my fate. You died on the road, he told me, but you may choose to walk the paths of others now. Not all souls receive such an offer. Not all are suited for it. But you, Dongjiang, your arrival aligns with a vacancy that must be filled. Will you accept the duty your timing has given you? The hall seemed to hold its breath. Lin's hand tightened around mine, and somewhere deep inside me, the truth I had been fleeing since the highway finally settled. There was no road left to return to, only the one stretching forward from here. For a long moment after the offer was spoken, the entire hall felt suspended in a hush so profound it seemed to press against my skin, as if the breath of the world had stalled, waiting for my decision to give it permission to move again. The figures at their desks remained motionless, their blurred faces turned ever so subtly toward me, not in expectation, but in a kind of impartial patience, the patience of beings who had watched thousands of such choices unfold across centuries and knew that whatever one man decided here would ripple only faintly through the great machinery of their work. Yet for me, standing in the muted glow of that vast chamber, the weight of the moment felt immense, like standing on the edge of a shoreline where the tide of my old life had finally retreated, leaving only wet sand and scattered fragments of memory behind. I thought of my father lying somewhere between life and death, thought of the frantic urgency that had driven me onto the road, thought of the ridiculous hope that had kept my hands clenched around the wheel as if I could force time to bend to my desperation. And now, realizing that he would never see me walk through his door again, that he might even believe I had abandoned him, I felt a deep ache bloom beneath my ribs, a hollowing sadness that no ghostly appointment could soothe. It was Linlin's hand on mine that finally steadied me, not its warmth, for it carried very little, nor its strength, which was delicate, but the quiet sincerity in her grip, a reassurance that beneath all the coldness and ritual of this place, someone saw me not as a case to be processed, but as a soul stunned by its own unraveling. She looked at me the way a lantern looks at a ship lost in fog, softly, steadily, offering guidance rather than demand. Her father watched us both with an expression carved from centuries of duty, and though stern, there was something resigned in his posture, as if he had long expected this convergence of paths. When I finally nodded slowly, helplessly, acknowledging the truth that there was nowhere else for me to go, a faint vibration swept through the hall, subtle as wind passing through tall grass, signaling acceptance, completion, inevitability. The father extended a hand toward a small pedestal near his desk, and upon it lay a thin strip of metal shaped like a tag, engraved with symbols that shifted like reflections on water. He pressed it gently against my chest, and though it had no weight, I felt something latch onto me with a sensation like a door quietly unlocking in the depth of my being. He spoke not aloud, but with a resonance that traveled through the strange currents of this realm, that this tag held my appointment, my identity, my authority, and that once I accepted it fully, I would be bound to the roads of the living in a way no mortal traveler ever was. With the appointment sealed, the hall changed around me. The mist thickened at the edges, curling like smoke around pillars that seemed to stretch taller, as if preparing to send me back toward the borders between worlds. The father gave me a final nod, a gesture neither warm nor dismissive, but bureaucratically respectful, the way one might acknowledge a new recruit joining a long-standing institution. Linlin stepped closer, her expression gentle, touched by a sadness she tried to hide, and without warning, the floor beneath us dissolved into a rolling fog that carried us upward and outward like a slow exhale. The hall receded behind us, its light dimming until it became no more than a distant, flickering lantern swallowed by an ocean of shadow. The transition back toward the living world was not a journey, but a drifting, a gentle slide through layers of dusk and faint memory. And when the fog finally parted, we stood on a quiet hillside overlooking my village. The air was cold but soft, scented with damp soil and distant pine, and the lights of the houses below glimmered weakly, each a small heartbeat pulsing in the darkness. For a moment I felt an ache so profound it silenced every other thought. This was home, the place I had longed to reach, the destination that had driven me to the road where my life ended. Yet, standing here now, separated from it by a veil no human eye could pierce, I felt like a child standing outside a window, palms pressed to the glass, watching a warmth he could never re-enter. Linlin led me gently down the slope until we reached the back of my family's house, where the garden still held the crops my father tended before his heart began to fail. The scent of earth rose softly, comforting and familiar. Through the window I could see my mother sitting beside my father's bed, her head bowed, her hands gently clasping his as if afraid he might drift away while she blinked. The room was lit by a single lamp, its glow warm and fragile in the gloom, and I felt something inside me crumble, not in despair but in the painful tenderness of love severed too soon. Linlin watched quietly beside me, allowing me the moment without interruption, her presence a steady anchor in a storm of emotion I could barely contain. She told me, with a softness that seemed woven from breath rather than sound, that though I could not speak to them or touch them, I could still leave something behind. She guided my hands toward the small bag I had carried with me in life, the money I had saved, the meager insurance of a laborer's future, and somehow, impossibly, my fingers closed around it. The fabric felt thin under my touch, unreal yet present. And when she urged me to lay it gently on the ground by the window, I obeyed, The moment I released the bag, it shimmered faintly, like frost catching moonlight, then solidified, becoming part of the living world again. In the room, my mother lifted her head abruptly, as though hearing a whisper, though no sound had reached her. Her gaze drifted toward the window, not in fear but in an instinctive searching, as if some tender part of her heart recognized that something of her son had brushed past the veil. She stood, walked slowly to the door, opened it, and stepped outside just far enough to notice the bag resting near the threshold. For a moment she stared, bewildered, then lifted it with trembling hands, pressing it to her chest as tears filled her eyes. She whispered my name, not calling, not questioning, but speaking it the way one speaks a truth they have always known yet never dared to accept. I reached toward her reflexively, uselessly, my fingers passing through the air that separated us like mist through mist, and though she could not see me, I felt the warmth of her love reach across the divide with a clarity that made the entire world seem unbearably tender. Linlin stepped closer, and the hillside around us began to fade, the outlines of houses dissolving into mist, the ground beneath us loosening as if preparing to lift us once more toward the realm of our new duty. My mother returned indoors, her figure framed by the warm light as she sat again beside my father, the bag still clutched in her hands. My father's chest rose and fell faintly, the rhythm fragile. Yet I sensed somehow that he would survive this night, and that perhaps the money, or the hope it represented, would ease the burden they now carried alone. As the last traces of the village dimmed beneath the thickening fog, I felt the ache inside me settle, not vanish, not soften, but settle into something steady, something I could carry without breaking. The mist enveloped us fully, and Linlin turned to me, her expression clearer now, more human than it had ever seemed in the halls of the department. She told me that, from this moment on, my path would stretch between worlds, that I would walk the outskirts of highways, linger near accident sites, guide wandering souls who did not yet understand they were dead, helping them cross before they became lost in the liminal spaces where sorrow gathers like dew. She added, almost shyly, that she would accompany me for a time, to help me learn, to ensure I did not lose myself in the threshold as many new guides do. The mist behind her parted like a curtain revealing a long road, the kind that stretches endlessly through night, disappearing into horizons stitched in gray and silver. It felt familiar not because I had traveled it before, but because some part of my soul recognized it as the place where lost things go to find direction again. As we stepped onto it, I glanced back one final time, hoping for one last glimpse of my home, but the world of the living had already folded away, leaving only a faint echo of warm light lingering at the edge of memory. The road ahead was quiet, lit not by lamps or stars, but by a pale glow that seemed to emanate from the path itself, guiding our steps. Linlin walked beside me, her presence steady and sure, and though I did not know what awaited us, I felt for the first time since my death a sense of purpose threading through the grief. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint hum of a car engine sputtering to a stop, followed by the soft, bewildered question of a soul realizing it had reached the end of its road. Linlin looked at me with a gentle nod. My new work had already begun. And as we moved toward the sound, I understood that though I would never drive home again, I would forever walk the long midnight highways, guiding those who had fallen where I once fell, ensuring that no one else drifted alone through the last stretch between life and whatever waited beyond. The fare that should not have been alive. It began on a night so empty it felt as though the world had slipped slightly out of alignment, as if the highways stretching across the dark had been peeled away from the living map and reattached to something older, quieter, and far less forgiving. Old Lee had driven night shifts for nearly 3 decades, long enough to know the personality of each hour. The soft pulse of 10 o'clock when the last diners return home, the lonely hum of midnight when the streetlights shimmer in the cold, the heavy, reluctant stillness of 2 a.m. when even the wind seems hesitant to stir. But this night carried a strange hollowness, a sensation not of silence but of absence, as though the dark had swallowed more than just sound. The frost on the windows seemed thicker than usual, clinging with an urgency that made him wipe the inside glass twice before he could see clearly, and even the headlights had a muted glow, struggling to carve through the long stretches of road that shimmered with patches of mist. He told himself it was fatigue, the ordinary kind that settled into the bones of a man his age. But the knot at the base of his neck disagreed, tightening with the faintest whisper of something unseen pressing close. He was about to turn back toward the city, ready to end the shift early and nurse a thermos of weak tea in the small apartment he kept for sleeping and little else, when the request pinged on his phone. A long-distance fare, one way leaving immediately, destination far beyond the edge of his usual routes. It came with a price so generous he wondered if it was a mistake. No night shift driver in his right mind would refuse it, especially not a man like him, who had debts to bury and a daughter he still visited in memory more than in life. He hesitated only a moment before accepting. The map loaded slowly, the signal flickering, but the pickup point was unmistakable. The city's northern edge, just before the highway bent toward the mountains. He started the engine again, listening to the familiar rumble settle into the cabin like a tired heartbeat. The thought of easy money steadied him, though not enough to chase away the odd sensation that the night had been waiting for this moment with a patience too precise to be coincidence. She stood alone under a failing street lamp when he arrived, her figure carved from the silver-blue glow cast by the arc of the bulb. The wind carried her hair across her face in soft, deliberate movements, and though the cold was sharp enough to freeze breath mid-air, she seemed untouched by it. Her posture relaxed, her hands folded calmly around the strap of a small leather bag. She was striking in a distant sort of way, beautiful, yes, but with a chilliness that created a boundary between her and the rest of the world, as though she moved through life slightly out of phase with everyone else. When she slid into the back seat, her movements were smooth, unhesitating, and something about the way she settled, straight-backed, composed, eyes lowered but alert, made him think of a person accustomed to long silences and longer journeys. She offered no greeting, only a quiet nod, and though her lips parted slightly, no words followed, not even when he confirmed the long route she had requested. She simply met his gaze in the rearview mirror with eyes too calm for the hour and inclined her head once more, as if acknowledging a rule they both already understood. This was a rite of silence. He pulled onto the highway, the tires whispering against the asphalt, the city lights shrinking behind them until only a dim, amber afterglow lingered on the horizon. The night deepened with each passing mile, collecting density like fog, gathering weight, and soon the road became a narrow corridor carved through darkness, bordered by forests that stood like silent, watching sentinels. The hum of the engine steadied him at first, a familiar companion in the long hours, but gradually, even that sound felt muted, swallowed by an atmosphere that seemed to thicken with each breath. The woman in the back remained perfectly still, not shifting once, not even when the road curved sharply or when the occasional pothole jolted the suspension. It was as if she were suspended in place, held by some tension invisible to him. When he glanced at her reflection in the mirror, she never blinked, never adjusted her scarf, never glanced out the window. She simply sat, poised, as if waiting for something to begin. Halfway up the highway, she asked him to stop at a crematorium by the side of the road, a lonely building with a dim light above the door, the glow distorted by the thick fog hugging the roof. Her voice was soft, distant, threaded with a strange stillness, as though each word was chosen slowly before being allowed to escape. She stepped out without meeting his eyes, disappearing into the building's shadowed entrance. He waited, engine running, fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel, listening to the soft ticking of the hazard lights bouncing off the icy pavement. The air felt heavier here, as though the land itself remembered too many endings. He glanced at the empty front passenger seat, the faint imprint of frost on the window beside it, and tried not to think about the way his breath fogged unnaturally quickly. When she returned, she carried a small bundle wrapped in dark cloth, cradling it in her arms with a tenderness that made him avert his eyes, understanding instinctively that whatever she held was more than luggage. She settled into the back seat again with the same silence, the same composure, but this time something in the air shifted an almost imperceptible change in weight, like the cabin had gained a presence rather than a passenger. And when he pulled back onto the road, he caught a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror that startled him. A second girl sitting beside the first, her long hair cascading over bare shoulders, her posture relaxed, almost playful, her head tilted as if she were humming to herself. She wore something that looked impossibly out of place in the winter night, bright summery swimwear, the kind worn at beaches, not crematoriums, and though she seemed unaware of the cold, her skin glowed faintly as though lit from within by a warmth that did not belong to the living world. Old Lee blinked hard, once, twice, convinced he was hallucinating, but each time he looked back into the mirror, the second girl remained. Her lips curled into a faint, mischievous smile, her eyes glinting with a kind of playfulness that left him unnerved rather than comforted. He glanced over his shoulder, intending to confirm her presence directly, but the moment he shifted his gaze away from the mirror, the seat behind him was occupied by only the first girl, the quiet, distant woman with the dark bundle resting in her lap. No one else. No bare shoulders, no warm glow, no swimsuit. Only the steady, emotionless presence of the woman who had hailed his cab. He turned back to the road, a cold sweat breaking along his neck, the sensation creeping downward like a thin trail of ice. He told himself his eyes were tired, his mind playing tricks, that exhaustion creates ghosts where none exist. But the mirror continued to betray him, showing fleeting glimpses of long hair swaying, of a smile too light for this hour, of someone leaning forward as if to whisper a secret directly into his ear. And each time he dared a quick glance over his shoulder, there was only one passenger, calm, silent, immaculate. The bundle in her hands seemed heavier now, drawing the dim light of the cabin into it, refusing to let any of it escape. The highway stretched onward, an endless ribbon of dim road markers and intermittent patches of fog that pressed close to the car like breath against glass. The world outside felt stripped of its familiar textures, nothing but silhouettes of bare trees, fences buried under frost, and the occasional reflective sign that flashed white and vanished into darkness again. Old Lee kept his eyes fixed on the yellow lines ahead, each dash of paint flickering beneath the headlights like Morse code tapping out a warning he could not decipher. He tried not to stare at the mirror, but the second figure tugged at the corner of his awareness. Her presence, soft yet intrusive, like a tune stuck in the back of his mind. When the wind picked up, carrying thin threads of cold air into the cabin despite the heater's steady hum, he felt a shiver run across his arms, a prickling wave that told him the night had shifted irreversibly the moment that second girl first smiled at him from a reflection that should have held only one face. For a long stretch of miles, no one spoke, not the composed woman holding the bundle, not the girl who appeared only in reflections, and certainly not old Lee, whose breath had grown shallow, held carefully in the fragile balance between disbelief and dread. It wasn't until the lights of a distant cornfield glimmered at the horizon, soft, rhythmic, impossibly out of place for an hour so deep in the night, that he realized the road was leading him somewhere he had not intended to go, somewhere the GPS had not marked, somewhere the darkness seemed to open willingly. But for now, he drove in silence, a man with two passengers, only one of whom existed in the world visible to the naked eye. And as the highway curved gently toward the first pulse of neon rising from the cornfields, he felt, with sudden clarity, that the night had not merely offered him a fare, it had chosen him. The road bent gently to the right, and as the cornfields rose on either side like dark walls shielding the world from whatever secrets the night was preparing to reveal, old Lee felt a strange heaviness crawl across the back of his neck, a pressure that tightened slowly, as if invisible fingers were tracing the shape of his spine. The headlights swept across the frost-coated stalks, painting them in long streaks of pale silver, and with each passing mile, the faint glow he had noticed earlier began to sharpen first into scattered flecks of yellow, then into a persistent pulse of neon light that shimmered in the distance, like a lighthouse beacon for those who should not be sailing the highway at this hour. It made no sense. Nothing should be lit here, in the middle of winter fields abandoned for the season. Yet the glow grew stronger, cutting through the darkness in thin vertical slivers that flickered with the rhythm of music too faint to hear but too steady to ignore. Lee's chest tightened. His foot eased from the accelerator almost without conscious thought, and the car drifted to the shoulder as if guided by a force older than instinct. He tried to convince himself it was simple curiosity, a driver's intuition alerting him to something unusual on the roadside. but the truth pulsed beneath his ribs, unmistakable. The night was not showing him something. It was presenting something to him. He rolled to a stop near a narrow dirt path that parted the cornfield like a wound. The neon glow spilled down the path in shaky strokes of blue, red, pink, and the faintest gold, bending with the stalks that swayed despite the windless air. Lee killed the engine, but the silence that followed felt almost too complete, as if the sound had been swallowed rather than extinguished. He glanced into the rearview mirror out of habit, a habit that now betrayed him with a glimpse he was not prepared to receive. The second girl, the one dressed in summer despite winter's bite, was leaning forward slightly, her elbows resting on her knees, her long hair spilling down like river water. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing path with a glimmer that bordered on hunger or yearning or recognition. And yet, when he turned around to look directly into the back seat, she was gone, replaced by the calm, rigid form of Lily, still holding the dark bundle in her lap, still staring at nothing, still breathing too quietly. Or perhaps not at all. For a moment, Lee closed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion drag heavily across his mind, as though sleep were pulling him down by the ankles. But even through that weariness, he felt drawn toward the light in the field, magnetically, inevitability, as though something behind the neon glow had been waiting for him long before he took this fare, long before he drove a car for a living, long before he learned that grief could hollow a man until he no longer feared the strange, as long as it wasn't cruel. He stepped out of the car, the cold hitting him first like a slap and then like an embrace, the kind that steals breath rather than gives it. His boots crunched through frost as he approached the path, and the deeper he walked, the louder the faint vibration became. Not music exactly, but the echo of music, the memory of bass thumping through walls, the residue of a party that existed somewhere between celebration and mourning. Then, as the corn parted, he saw it. A building that should not have been there, not in any map or memory. A small structure raised on temporary beams, wrapped in strings of neon lights that flickered with the sickly enthusiasm of a carnival surviving on borrowed electricity. Above the entrance, a crudely painted sign read "Open all night," though the paint dripped in ways that suggested the letters had bled rather than been brushed on. Men and women moved around the entrance, too thin, too pale, too energetic for a freezing rural midnight, with expressions that shifted too quickly when the light caught their faces, as if their features hadn't settled entirely into shape. They passed money between each other with hands that shook slightly, not from cold but from excitement or desperation. And each time the door to the structure swung open, a burst of color spilled out along with the faint echo of laughter that didn't sound like it came from any living throat. Lee froze at the edge of the clearing, every instinct in him screaming to turn back. But then he saw her. The swimsuit girl, the one who appeared only in the mirror, was standing on the stage inside the building, framed by swirling neon light, her long hair shimmering as though underwater, her body moving in rhythms too fluid for the stiff cold of this night. She laughed, a sound he could not hear through the glass and distance, but one he felt reverberate through the ground beneath them, and leaned forward toward a man seated near the stage. Her movements were flirtatious, casual, practiced, but there was something wrong about the way her limbs stretched, something too elastic, too smooth, as if her joints belonged to someone who had forgotten the weight of a living body. When she reached out to collect the bills the man offered, her fingers curled around the money with a grip that seemed both eager and unfamiliar, like someone mimicking a gesture she had done thousands of times in life but could not quite replicate in death. Old Lee stared, throat tight, and for a moment he felt as though he were watching not a performance but a memory wearing itself thin. The neon lights flickered harder now, casting the figures in jittering frames, each flash revealing subtle distortions, faces too long, shadows that clung too close to bodies, eyes that glowed faintly as if reflecting a fire none of them acknowledged. He looked again at the swimsuit girl, and for the briefest instant, faster than a blink, the stage lights caught her face in a way that stripped the illusion clean. Her skin was gray-blue beneath the shimmer of neon. Her lips were pale, cracked. Her eyes were wide, glossy, hollow, and her hair, which moments earlier had seemed alive, hung heavy and wet, clinging to her shoulders like strands that had never fully dried from the moment she died. His breath caught in his throat, but before panic could root him to the ground, movement erupted at the edge of the clearing. 4 figures in black, hooded and tall, stepped toward the building with a synchronization that felt ceremonial rather than human. Their presence warped the air, pushing cold outward in sharp waves. They carried something in their hands, lanterns or torches or flames, so concentrated they burned without smoke, and without hesitation they began to circle the building, pressing the fire against its walls. The neon light sputtered violently. The thin wood cracked. The revelers inside froze, their faces turning toward the back door as if sensing a command, and then the fire surged upward with unnatural speed, racing along the building's frame like a living thing starving for release. The swimsuit girl looked toward the entrance, her expression shifting from playful to startled to pleading in a heartbeat, and as the flames engulfed the structure, she reached out halfway, as though trying to call someone, or escape, or finish something she had left undone. Lee stumbled backward, tripping over roots and frost as the fire roared, though its heat never reached him. It was too contained, too intentional, growing not outward into the field but upward into the sky, as though it burned, not wood but memory, not air but the remnants of a place that should never have existed. He turned and ran, the crunch of frost beneath his boots loud in the oppressive stillness behind him, the neon glow fading as if swallowed whole. By the time he reached the car, he was gasping, hands shaking as he fumbled for the door handle, and when he threw himself inside and slammed the door shut, the interior felt suffocatingly quiet, as though the car had sealed itself from the world to protect something fragile or hide something unspeakable. He sat there for a long moment, chest heaving, sweat freezing along his brow despite the heat blasting from the vents. Then he looked into the rearview mirror and saw her, not Lily. The swimsuit girl. She lay curled on the back seat, eyes closed, breathing softly as though she'd been sleeping for hours. Her hair was dry now, her skin warm-toned beneath the cabin light. Her posture relaxed, peaceful, entirely alive. She looked nothing like the figure he had seen inside the burning structure, nothing like the fleeting glimpses caught in the mirror earlier. She looked human. She looked real. She looked as though she had simply climbed into the back seat while he wasn't watching and decided to rest. His heart slammed against his ribs. He turned around sharply. Only Lily sat there, alone, unmoving, cradling the bundle. He looked back at the mirror. The sleeping girl remained. Her smile, faint and tired, appeared for just a second as if she knew he was watching. And then it vanished with the next blink, leaving only Lily and the weight of something unspoken pressing down on the air between them. Old Lee gripped the steering wheel, forcing himself to breathe. The night had shifted again, nudging him to continue, nudging him toward a truth he had not yet earned but was already entangled with. He started the engine, and as he pulled away from the cornfield, the fire behind him rose in a final burst of light, painting the frost gold before collapsing into darkness once more as though the night had erased a mistake, or fulfilled a duty, or concluded a ritual that had been waiting for an audience. For nearly 20 minutes after leaving the burning cornfield behind, Old Lee drove in a silence so taut it felt like the air inside the car had thickened, as though whatever force governed the night had wrapped its hands around the cabin and tightened, preventing anything as simple and human as ordinary breath from moving freely. The road stretched ahead in a long, pale ribbon of frost, illuminated only by the timid reach of the taxi's headlights, and with each passing mile the darkness seemed to grow denser, not fading as civilization approached, but deepening, folding inward, closing like a long corridor whose walls refused to let him see the exit. The rearview mirror hovered at the edge of his vision, threatening to betray him with another impossible glimpse, yet he forced himself to look not once, terrified of what might be revealed there, whether a sleeping girl, a drowned face, or nothing at all. Lily sat motionless behind him, the dark bundle resting securely in her lap, and though she appeared calm, there was something in the way. Her fingers clenched the cloth tight enough to whiten the knuckles that told him she was not unaware of the shift in the air, of the tremor beneath the surface of the night. Even if she could not see the girl he had glimpsed again and again, she sensed the weight of something riding alongside them. Then, so sudden it felt like the night itself had cracked open. Two beams of harsh white light erupted behind them, flooding the cabin with a glare that carved sharp, trembling shadows across the dashboard. A roar of an engine followed a sound too aggressive for the hour, too hungry, and within seconds a dark SUV lunged into view through the rear window, its grille enormous, predatory, its headlights burning through the night like the eyes of something feral. Ly's heart lurched. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, but before panic could settle fully, the SUV surged closer, closing the distance with a speed that should not have been possible on such a narrow, frozen road. The vehicle swerved once, twice, brushing the edge of the lane, its movements animalistic, as though trying to herd the taxi rather than overtake it. Something cold slid down Lee's spine. This was no ordinary reckless driver. It was pursuit. Intentional, patient, coordinated. He eased the accelerator down, trying to maintain control without provoking a spin-out. But the SUV mirrored every motion with calculating precision. It drifted closer until its headlights saturated the taxi's interior with a blinding brilliance, stripping the world of detail. Lee couldn't see the driver. Not even a silhouette, just those two merciless orbs of light boring into the back of his skull. His pulse hammered in his throat, but before he could react further, something shifted behind him with a suddenness that made him flinch. Lily, who had sat rigid and silent for nearly an hour, leaned forward slightly, the motion slow but deliberate, her voice emerging with a clarity and sharpness that bore no resemblance to the still, almost hollow tone she'd used earlier. She spoke not with fear, but with the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to calculating danger. Without glancing at the mirror, she told him in a low, steady murmur to hold the wheel loosely and prepare to veer right at the next break in the guardrail. The words slid into the cabin like instructions delivered through a dream. Soft, eerie, and chillingly confident. Something in Lee's instincts, old and battered but still capable of recognizing truth when it breathed on his shoulder, told him she was not guessing. She knew. He glanced at the GPS screen. No breaks in the guardrail for miles, but before he could dismiss her words, he saw it. A narrow dirt access road, nearly invisible under frost, emerging like a dark gash in the barrier. He jerked the wheel, the tires screaming against the frozen asphalt, and the taxi swerved into the access road just as the SUV lunged forward, its front bumpers skimming the taxi's rear with a scraping howl that shook the vehicle. The taxi bounced violently, fishtailing across the dirt, the rear lights casting wild arcs across the corn stubble, and Lee fought the wheel with desperate strength, trying to keep the car from spinning out. Behind them, the SUV overshot the turn, roaring past, braking too late, its tires screeching as it attempted to loop back around. The access road descended into a shallow basin between two empty barns, the structures looming like dark, derelict sentinels, their roofs collapsing inward under decades of neglect. Lily lifted her head, her eyes sharper now, awake in a way that unsettled Lee more than the chase itself. She told him to kill the headlights. He obeyed without understanding why, and the world collapsed instantly into near total darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the SUV's beams sweeping erratically across the distant road as it searched, prowled, hunted. The taxi sat buried in shadow, breathless, invisible beneath the broken silhouette of the barn. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The engine ticked softly, cooling, and Lee could hear his own pulse pounding against the inside of his ribs, each thud a reminder that he was still alive, still filled with fear that tasted metallic on his tongue. Lily's breathing was quiet but steady, like someone who had learned long ago to hide panic beneath folds of discipline. After what felt like an eternity, the SUV slowly rolled past the mouth of the access road again, its headlights scanning the fields with a predatory slowness. And then, after a final lingering pass, it accelerated away, vanishing into the dark, with a low growl that seemed to echo long after the vehicle itself had gone. Lee released a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, the adrenaline crashing through him in a sharp wave that left him dizzy. He turned toward Lily, ready to ask who those men were, what they wanted, why they chased them. But she raised her hand not in warning but in a gesture of exhaustion, resignation, acceptance. Her gaze drifted downward to the bundle in her lap. the cloth now slightly loosened at one corner as if jostled during the chase. Beneath it, he glimpsed the faintest curve of polished wood, the kind used for urn cases, and the truth that had hovered at the edge of his awareness now stepped directly into view. Without lifting her eyes, she told him the story, not in a dramatic confession, not in a trembling breakdown, but in a voice carved by years of hopelessness, the tone of someone who had long stopped expecting deliverance. Her father had gone to prison when she and her younger sister Faye were still girls. Their mother, overwhelmed by hardship, had fallen ill until illness became frailty, and frailty became permanent paralysis. Debt accumulated like dust, bills piled like broken bricks. Life narrowed into a corridor lined with hunger, humiliation, and helpless choices. Lily worked any job she could find, legal or otherwise, but the money was never enough. Faye, reckless and radiant, even in suffering, insisted she would help, that she would not let her sister carry everything alone. She entered the nightlife, the underground clubs, the sketchy bars where men paid for companionship under flickering lights, and when that still wasn't enough, Faye went deeper into places like the Neon Cornfield nightclub, places that fed on desperation and offered quick cash in return for pieces of one's safety, dignity, or soul. At this point, her voice trembled, not because she was recounting tragedy, but because she had reached the memory that refused to stay buried. The fire. The sudden blaze that devoured the club and everyone inside. A fire started not by accident, but by the same hooded men Lee had seen. Men who cleaned up places like that, disposing of sins not by justice but by obliteration. Faye died there. Lily arrived too late, arriving only as the bodies were collected, the ashes sifted, the mistakes swept into quiet corners. She held her sister's broken remains in a box no bigger than a purse, and promised, in a voice torn raw, that she would take Faye home, back to the village they once played in, back to the earth where they had grown up together, back to the mother who still called both their names when fever blurred her thoughts. As Lily spoke, her body seemed to change, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The rigid calm she had shown earlier dissolved into a quiet grief that seeped into every word. She said the urn was all she had left. She said the men in the SUV weren't chasing her, they were chasing the truth. She carried something they didn't want returned home, something that tied their crime to the ashes in her lap. And then, with a shiver so faint Lee barely saw it, she whispered something that made the road feel colder. Faye didn't leave her alone, not entirely. She had felt her. She had sensed her, on the ride to the crematorium, at the cornfield, and even now, as if Faye were trying to reach her, guide her, apologize, or simply accompany her one last time. Lee's throat tightened. He dared a glance at the rearview mirror. For a moment, just a flicker, he saw the second girl again, Faye, leaning forward slightly as though listening to her sister's confession. Her expression was no longer mischievous or playful. It was tender, even sorrowful. A faint smile lifted the corner of her mouth. Not teasing this time, but grateful, soft, a whisper of the life she once had. Lee blinked. She was gone. Only Lily remained, shoulders trembling, face turned toward the darkness outside as if she feared her grief might shatter if she looked at him. The night around them shifted subtly, a low sigh of wind threading through the barn's broken slats, carrying with it a sense of movement, of inevitability, as though the road ahead had already chosen its course long before they turned into the basin. Lee restarted the engine slowly, reverently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance in the car. The headlights flicked back on, washing the terrain in pale yellow. The barn loomed behind them like the ghost of a place that had forgotten its purpose. The highway awaited, a long corridor stretching toward a village with a grieving mother, an empty coffin, and a story no living person wished to inherit. As they pulled away from the basin, climbing carefully back toward the road, the night felt different, less like an enemy, and more like a witness. The silence in the car was no longer heavy. It was sacred, shared, and somewhere in the quiet, something warm brushed Lee's shoulder. But when he turned, Lily hadn't moved, and the back seat was empty, except for the urn, The rest of the drive unfolded like a slow descent through layers of the night, each mile pulling them deeper into a quiet that felt less like the absence of noise and more like the world deliberately holding its breath, waiting for something solemn to take place. Old Lee kept both hands on the wheel, not out of fear anymore, but out of a strange reverence, as if he had accidentally stumbled into a procession he didn't fully understand, a funeral march conducted in motion across the dark highways of the countryside. The fields grew wider, the houses rarer, the sky fainter as pockets of fog drifted in from the hills, wrapping themselves around the car with a softness that felt deceptive, almost intimate. Beside him, Lily sat with her shoulders slightly bowed, her fingers tracing the cloth-wrapped urn in her lap as though trying to memorize every curve of it, every hidden angle, every secret it carried. And though she didn't speak, her silence carried the heaviness of someone preparing themselves for the last act of a tragedy they had long known was inevitable. When the taxi finally left the main highway and turned onto the narrower county road leading toward the village, Lee felt an unexplainable tightness in his chest, as though the night had subtly shifted in texture, becoming denser and more suffocating. The road was flanked on both sides by a sparse forest, the trees tall and thin, their branches bare and crooked like fingers reaching inward. Occasionally, the headlights caught the glimmer of frost on the bark, the cold shimmer making the trunks look like gravestones in a forgotten cemetery. The closer they got to the village, the more Lee felt a sense of unseen company, a soft but persistent weight in the back seat that was neither threatening nor comforting, merely present, like a breath that wasn't as lingering behind him whenever he inhaled. They reached the first edge of the village, a small archway once painted bright red but now faded into a weary rust just as the fog thickened into something almost tactile. The homes were simple, many with dim porch lights that glowed faintly behind curtains, casting silhouettes onto windows. It was the kind of place where silence wasn't an anomaly, but a companion. Lily told him to continue past the small grocery store and the empty playground to the far end of the village, where the funeral hall sat beside a grove of leafless trees. Her voice was almost a whisper, and Lee sensed she wasn't speaking to him alone but to someone else, someone who might still be listening. The funeral hall appeared slowly through the fog, a low concrete structure with a slanted roof and a single light burning above the entrance. It stood in a hollow of earth that seemed deliberately chosen for sorrow, as if the land itself understood that certain rituals required a place where time could move differently, softer, slower, respectful of the dead. Lee parked the taxi and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was so complete it ached. Lily didn't open the door immediately. She sat there, holding the urn tightly, her breathing shallow, her lips pressed together as if she feared that speaking would shatter something fragile between this world and the next. Lee waited without urging. Something told him that impatience here would be offensive not to Lily, but to the presence that had traveled with them. Eventually she inhaled, a small, trembling breath, and stepped out of the car. The fog swirled around her ankles, curling upward like a living thing, brushing her coat as though welcoming her home. Lee followed, his legs stiff from the drive, but the cold night air cleared his senses just enough to make him aware of how strange it felt to stand on solid ground again after the long, surreal descent through the night. The door of the funeral hall creaked faintly when Lily pushed it open. Inside, dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead, bathing the room in an anemic glow. A large wooden coffin rested on a platform near the center, freshly polished, its surface glinting with the sheen of new varnish. Beside it lay a framed photograph draped with flowers. Lee's blood chilled. The photograph was of Faye, not a formal portrait, not a somber memorial shot, but a candid picture, her smiling broadly, mischievously, head tilted slightly, hair falling over one shoulder, eyes bright with a life that seemed impossible to reconcile with the coffin beside it. It was unmistakable. The same face he had seen laughing in the back seat, teasing him, smiling in the cornfield nightclub. The same face he had seen half a dozen times without acknowledging the truth until it stood before him now, bordered in white chrysanthemums. His breath hitched. The room felt colder. Lily walked slowly toward the coffin, her steps measured, almost ritualistic. She placed the urn on the wooden table beside it, her fingertips lingering on it as if releasing something precious. The room seemed to hold its breath. Lie's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to step back, to leave, to escape this impossible confrontation with death and truth. But something rooted him in place, a quiet gravity, an understanding that he had been drawn into a final act that required witnesses. A soft sound broke the stillness. It wasn't the groan of the building or the creak of a coffin. It was something lighter, gentler, a whisper of movement that brushed past him like a warm breeze, impossibly warm for so cold a night. Lily didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her head slightly and whispered a single word. Faye. Not a call, not a plea, a greeting. The temperature shifted. Lee felt it ripple through the room, an almost imperceptible rise in warmth near his shoulder, the faintest pressure as though someone had passed close by. Then the air near the coffin shimmered, not visibly, not in a manner that could be described with light or shadow, but in sensation, a subtle distortion of presence, as if the atmosphere had adjusted itself to accommodate one more being. Lily closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she rested them on the coffin lid. Lee saw her then not with his eyes, not exactly, but with something deeper, a recognition more than a vision. Faye knelt beside her sister, hair falling over her shoulder, face soft with gratitude. No mischief now, no teasing glint, only peace, and a deep, aching love. She reached out, her hand passing through the fabric of Lily's sleeve, yet somehow still touching her. Lily inhaled sharply as if feeling the warmth of that touch. Faye turned toward Lee next, offering him a small nod, a gesture containing layers of unspoken meaning, gratitude, farewell, permission to let the memory of her settle gently instead of violently. Then she stepped backward toward the coffin, moving not like a spectral wraith, but like someone returning to a room where she belonged. She leaned down as if settling into a final embrace with the body waiting within. Lily sobbed quietly. Lee felt his throat tighten painfully. The lights flickered once softly, like a blink, and the sensation of Faye's presence folded gently into the silence. The room was ordinary again, except it wasn't. Not for Lee, not for Lily, not for the night that had carried them here. Lily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her expression exhausted but lighter, as though a knot inside her had finally loosened. She thanked Lee softly, her voice cracked but sincere, not with dramatic emotion, but with the quiet relief of someone who had completed an impossible journey of the soul. She told him her mother was in the village clinic and that she needed to go there before dawn. Lee nodded, unable to speak, still shaken by what he had witnessed, or half-witnessed, or sensed experiences that lived in the strange space between memory and dream where truth often hides. They left the funeral hall, closing the door gently behind them. The fog outside seemed thinner now, retreating into the edges of the grove, as if satisfied with the conclusion. Lee helped Lily into the taxi again, and as he slid into the driver's seat, he hesitated before looking into the rearview mirror. He saw only one passenger, one living passenger, one grieving sister. The back seat was empty except for a faint impression on the cushion, like the ghost of a person who had sat there for many miles, a warmth that hadn't yet faded. Lee drove toward the clinic, the night beginning to pale faintly at the edges with the first hints of morning. The heaviness in the car had changed, no longer oppressive, but solemn, as if the night had accepted its role and was now preparing to release them into dawn. Lily stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on the passing village houses, perhaps imagining her mother inside one of them, waiting unknowingly for the return of one daughter and the farewell of another. When they reached the small clinic, Lily stepped out, clutching the urn again. Before closing the door, she told Lee that her sister had liked him, that she had felt safe riding in his taxi. Lee felt a sting behind his eyes, but said nothing, merely nodded. She walked toward the clinic entrance, her silhouette small against the dim, merging light. Lee remained in the taxi for several minutes after she disappeared inside, the engine idling softly, his hand still trembling on the wheel, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming weight of the night he had lived through, a night that had stretched and folded around him like a long corridor linking worlds. He wondered, for a moment, whether Faye had truly left. And just as that thought passed through him, the mirror fogged slightly as if someone had leaned close to breathe a final goodbye. Dawn had not yet broken. But the night was losing some of its cruelty as Lee pulled away from the clinic, watching the building shrink in the mirror until it became only a smudge of pale blue light in the fog. The road ahead felt strangely weightless now, as if the world had loosened its grip on him after the long, haunted journey from the city. He drove slowly, almost gingerly, as though afraid that pressing too hard on the accelerator might tear open the delicate seam between everything he had witnessed and the fragile ordinariness of morning. The exhaustion hit him all at once. Not like a wave, but like the slow collapse of a structure that had been standing only out of stubbornness. His eyelids grew heavy, his pulse sluggish, the hum of the engine sinking into a hypnotic rhythm that blended with the faint ringing still lodged in his ears from the chase, the fire, the spectral presence in his back seat. He pulled over near a small rest area on the outskirts of the village, parking beneath a crooked street lamp that flickered weakly, throwing pale, intermittent circles of light across the windshield. He knew he shouldn't sleep there. Not after such a night, not with his mind still tangled in shadows. But fatigue was an anchor that refused to be lifted. He leaned the seat back slightly and allowed his eyes to close, telling himself it would be only for a minute, that the world would still be the same when he opened them again, that the night had already shown him its worst and could inflict nothing more. Even as he drifted, he felt something, perhaps memory, perhaps intuition, brush against the back of his thoughts, reminding him that nothing about this journey had obeyed the ordinary rules of life. When he awoke, it was with the abrupt, disorienting clarity of someone surfacing from a dream too vivid to escape quickly. His first sensation was that of physical displacement, the strange awareness that his posture was wrong, that the angle of the seat beneath him felt unfamiliar. He blinked against the dim light that filtered through the windshield and realized, with a dawning confusion that froze his breath, that he was not in the driver's seat. He was sitting in the passenger seat, upright, belt fastened, hands folded in his lap like someone preparing to be driven somewhere. His head whirled in a slow, nauseating arc as he turned to look at the man sitting where he should have been. The man was broad-shouldered, solid, wearing a thick jacket zipped to the throat, and his hands gripped the steering wheel with the calm assurance of someone who had driven this car before, not recently, but often. His face was round, unremarkable, almost friendly, the kind of face one might trust at first glance simply because it lacked anything memorable. He glanced toward Lee with a small, courteous nod, the sort of acknowledgement exchanged between two strangers sharing an elevator. The breath that escaped Lee's lungs trembled. He tried to speak, to ask who the man was, how he had gotten into the car, why he was driving Lee's taxi, but the words caught somewhere between his mind and his throat, emerging only as a dry, broken exhale. The man did not seem bothered by the silence. He drove with an easy smoothness, guiding the taxi back toward the highway with the familiarity of someone who knew its weight, its turning radius, its habits. After a moment, in a voice neither loud nor soft but uncomfortably steady, he told Lee that he had looked tired, that he had stepped in temporarily so Lee could rest properly. The phrasing was wrong, not in meaning but in implication, as though doing such a thing were completely ordinary, as though strangers routinely slipped into cars to take over long night fares while the owner slept. Lee's pulse hammered against his ribs. He glanced to the back seat, half expecting to see another impossible figure. Lily, Faye, or something far more sinister. But the back seat was empty, spotless, as though no one had ever sat there at all. The man continued driving, commenting casually that he had already paid the fare full price plus compensation for the trouble. His voice was polite, measured, and yet there was something beneath it, a cadence that felt rehearsed, as if he had spoken these same words countless times to countless tired drivers who, like Lee, had crossed paths with things they shouldn't have. Lee stared at the folded bills placed neatly in the center console, crisp and intentionally arranged. His hand shook slightly as he picked them up. They felt real, too real. The man smiled faintly, satisfied. Then he turned the taxi down a narrow lane Lee hadn't noticed before the entrance to the village crematorium. The building loomed ahead, its brick walls washed in a sickly gray blue by the fading night, the chimney still releasing a thin curl of smoke that twisted upward like the ghost of a sigh. The man slowed, parking beside the loading bay with a precision that suggested he had done this many times. He unbuckled his belt, offered Lee one more courteous nod, and opened the door. A gust of cold air swept into the cabin as he stepped out. His boots made dull, heavy sounds against the frozen ground. For a brief moment, as he reached the crematorium's door, he paused and looked back at Lee, not with menace, not with warmth, but with a strange neutrality, as if silently acknowledging that Lee had participated in a process older and larger than both of them. And then he stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a muffled thud. Lee sat frozen. His breath fogged the windshield in slow bursts. His heartbeat echoed through the empty car. The familiar shape of the steering wheel in the stranger's hands replayed in his mind again and again, too vivid to dismiss as a dream. He forced himself to climb back into the driver's seat. The imprint of the man's weight still lingered in the cushion. Warm, undeniable. The keys were still in the ignition, waiting for him. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he looked up at the crematorium, at the single light flickering above the door, at the quiet plume of smoke drifting into the early morning sky, at the building that seemed suddenly aware of him. Something about it watched him back, something not hostile, but heavy with purpose. And then he understood. He had driven a dead girl home. He had watched her spirit enter her coffin. He had carried her sister to the threshold of grief. And now, he had been driven by a man who spoke softly, moved quietly, and disappeared into a crematorium without looking back. He hadn't given up his seat. It had been taken, borrowed, used by someone whose job wasn't to guide the living, but the dead. He gripped the wheel, shaken to his core, and whispered a trembling thank you into the silence for the help, for the protection, for allowing him to return alive when everything about the night suggested he shouldn't. As he pulled away from the crematorium, the sky deepened into a bruised lavender. The edge of dawn bleeding faintly above the hills, the world felt lighter, though still marked by an invisible fingerprint he couldn't wipe away. And as the taxi rolled onto the open road, Lee caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Not a figure, not a face, just a faint trail of warmth on the seat behind him, as though a passenger, neither living nor dead, had only just departed. If you're still with me now, if your room feels a little different, a little quieter, as though something has slipped back into the walls to listen from somewhere you can't see, then perhaps the night has done its work. 5 stories, 5 shadows traveling with you through this long stretch of darkness. Some of them wanted answers. Some wanted forgiveness. Some only wanted to be seen one last time before their path pulled them somewhere deeper. But they've all stepped away now, leaving you here in the soft afterglow of a night that isn't quite finished. When you turn off this episode, the silence might feel heavier than usual. The air might shift, as though someone has just left the room or just entered it. If that happens, don't be afraid. It's only the echo of the stories settling into place. They always do. Thank you for keeping the midnight company tonight. Rest well, if the dreams let you. And if they don't, you know where to find me. This is Dread. Good night, and keep your lights low.